Chapter 1. This night was still as the others before it, but tension hung thick and impenetrable in the air, intent on crushing her chest until she succumbed to the weight of suffocation. Philadelphia was not being kind this evening. The faces of the homes across from Hazel's did not shine with candlelight and frolickers, but rather to grimace and glare with unspoken displeasures. There were no stars to be seen pinpricking a velvety sky. Instead, oppressive bricks of iron clouds lingered overhead, not to threaten rain but simply to incite a bout of depression amongst the city dwellers below. She heard no boisterous whoops of partygoers or raucous yawps of uncouth neighbors from the nearby blocks. Though the hour had not yet struck midnight, even Nellie, ordinarily prone to fits and night scares in her sleep, was quite silent in her slumber. It was an omen. Hazel patted the letter against her knee, reluctant to read it despite the strange night's urgings. It was no more crumpled and worn than the day she'd received it those 2 long years ago, likely because she had refused to read it since its receipt. Though it was not but a single piece of paper, it felt heavy in her hand, an elephantine reminder of the haunting truth. She dreaded seeing those words again, but she knew she must if she wished to move forward with her plans. It was time. The candle's flame burned static and bright, its delicate heat licking her cheeks as she unfolded the note. Her first glimpse of the penmanship was enough to jerk her back to the days she first saw those clumsy, looping characters, and an unsolicited whimper slipped from her lips. With shaking fingers she held the letter aloft to cast a sufficient glow upon its hateful surface, and began to read. 26. September 1864. To Mrs. William Walker. I pen this letter with a heavy heart, and my deepest condolences, for, though I am but a stranger to you, I feel it is my duty to inform you of your husband's death. It was I who witnessed his unfortunate passing after he received a gunshot to the neck Thursday morning. He was laid to rest in a field outside of Fredericktown, Missouri, with other fallen comrades, on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. William was a dear friend and a good man. He often spoke of you, and he beamed with pride upon mention of his daughter Nellie. Please know you have my sympathy in your time of grief. Sincerely, Sergeant Lewis McCall. Tears, hot and balmy, slipped from the corners of Hazel's eyes as tight, gripping pain stole her breath and pinched her heart. Night after night, she trailed her hand over the bedclothes as she drifted to sleep, hoping desperately to feel William's sturdy form beside her. And, night after night, she realized her only companion in the darkness was a memory. For 2 years she permitted herself the hope that the letter was wrong, that the mysterious Sergeant Lewis McCall had made a mistake, or, perhaps, had written the letter as an ill-mannered trick for his own amusement. She had even entertained fantasies of William waking beneath a pile of fresh earth, only to dig himself free and stumble to the nearest hospital for treatment, before making the long journey back to Philadelphia. To her, however, as she now reread the letter, her futile fancies were stifled into the bitter reality that she was, indeed, a widow. With an ache in her heart, she dropped the paper to the tabletop and lowered her face into her hands. The tears came faster now, flowing between her fingers and dribbling in grief-stricken rivers to her sleeves. She tried to quiet herself, to weep silently, but her sobs burst forth in an unbidden storm of 2 years' weight. Repugnance for carrying on so met her grief in equal measure, yet the long-repressed sorrow refused to relent, and even her bawling did nothing to quell the empty anguish in her soul. "Ma!" The small, meek voice rose from the darkness and washed over the grieving woman in waves. She lifted her head from her hands to see the silhouette of her elfin daughter standing before her. Nellie's nightgown hung limply around her ankles, and her favorite doll poked out from the arm she hugged to her chest. Hazel was immediately flooded with a surge of humiliation for being found in such a state. Hazel hastily wiped her cheeks free of moisture and said sternly, "You should be in bed, Nellie." "Why are you crying, Ma?" the child asked, her eyes bright with curiosity Under ordinary circumstances, Hazel would have admonished Nellie for dismissing an order and insist that she return to her bed. Tonight, however, in the midst of her bereavement, and with the plans for their future looming before her, Hazel allowed the persistence. "Come," she said, twisting in her seat and extending her arms outward. Nellie shuffled forward obediently, and Hazel gathered the little body up onto her lap. Brushing fingers through the girl's sleep-mussed locks, Hazel asked, "Do you know where we are going on Tuesday?" "Missouri," Nellie said promptly. "Missouri," Hazel corrected her. Nellie leaned her cheek against Hazel's shoulder, who propped her chin gently upon the youthful head. "Do you know why we are going to Missouri?" A drowsy yawn lingered in the child's throat as she murmured, "No, Ma." Hazel's eyes drifted to the letter still lying open on the table. The inked words gleamed in the candlelight, shimmering with the reality she faced, and the corners of the paper fluttered with the breeze of her breath as she explained, "Your father is buried in Missouri. We are going to visit him." "Is he expecting us?" The question was so innocent, so virtuous, that the slender woman smiled slightly, though the smile was marred with sadness. "I am sure God has told him we are coming," she said. Nellie raised her head to look at her mother in confusion and repeated, "God?" "Yes, darling. Remember, your father is with God now." To prevent her daughter from seeing the tears welling in her eyes, Hazel pressed a hand to Nellie's temple and eased the small head back onto her shoulder. Nellie sighed with contentment. "Do I get to wear my best dress?" she asked, her voice hollow as the yawn was finally expelled. Hazel swallowed hard to subdue the sob bubbling within her and felt a fresh tear rolling down her cheek. The letter lying innocuously on the table was not the only letter she had tried to banish from mind. There was another, penned by her own hand and likely kept in a desk not far from her late husband's grave. That letter was the reason she had forced herself to revisit Sergeant McCall's writings this unusual evening, to reopen the very wound she had compelled herself to close. Somewhere near Fredericktown, a man was preparing to make her his wife. Realizing she had failed to answer Nellie's question, Hazel said softly, "Yes, you will wear your best dress and your Sunday shoes, so that God and Pa will be very proud to see you." The innocent girl's breathing grew deep and slow, and Hazel felt the tiny body become limp against hers as sleep took Nellie once more. Hazel wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her close, and stood to take her to bed. As she tucked Nellie in, she gazed down upon the shadowed face of her slumbering child and realized for the first time just how much the little lamb resembled William. Her skin, even in darkness, was that of an alabaster peach, and her rounded jaw relaxed as his had in dreams. A pang struck Hazel's heart, and she thought again of the letter and the man she would soon meet. At 27, she was to be a bride once more, but she would always be William Walker's widow. Chapter 2. Though the hour was quite early, just 4:05 without the merest sliver of daybreak in the morning sky, Hazel was quite awake. She had not slept well for the anxious prickling in her belly and should have been sluggish upon rising, but she found herself alert and focused as she dressed Nellie in travel clothes and closed the house up for safekeeping until the next tenants took residence. The early October breeze was no more than a whisper in the quiet morning, yet Hazel felt her cheeks pinkening with its sharp autumn chill as the hired boy navigated them through the Philadelphian streets. He was the butcher's son, a wiry lad of 13 with little to say and even less personality, but he was well-mannered and loaded the buggy with all that remained of the widow's possessions since William's passing without complaint. There were relatively few trunks to heave and stow, to be sure. Hazel had sold the most valuable of her treasures and inheritances to purchase the fare to Missouri, and she parted the rest for more modest sums in the interest of convenient travel. Nellie fell asleep once more on the way to the train station, and Hazel roused the waif-like child rather apologetically upon arrival. It was very early indeed, and Nellie was unaccustomed to such hours, but the chestnut-haled mother felt the richest strings of guilt for uprooting the girl from the only home she had ever known to venture westward with the stranger of a man. Hazel had never imagined such a twist in her journey in life, much less her fatherless daughter of only 5 tender years, and she loathed the helplessness that accompanied the choice. Had she any family in Pennsylvania or neighboring states, she could have turned to them in her time of need. Unfortunately, her sole living relative was a sister who had married a miner and moved to the Oregon frontier years before, which left Hazel with a decision: take refuge in one of the city's public shelters for the poverty-stricken, or journey to Oregon City and make a life for Nellie amongst kin. The decision was daunting but not difficult. They would go west. The hired boy left the mare and buggy to aid Hazel with her trunks, then departed with a pocketful of payment and a polite, "Safe travels, Mrs. Walker." Another took over to stack the luggage onto a wheeled cart. This one was nearer to manhood than the butcher's son, perhaps just shy of 17, and Hazel didn't know if he was employed by the railroad but permitted the assistance for the sake of ease. Nellie clung to her mother's hand, with tired, droopy eyes and a drowsy sway in her gait, as they strode into the station, the young man trailing closely behind with their things. Hazel had safely pocketed the tickets in her travel coat before departing from home, but she brushed her fingertips over them to reassure herself of their presence. They were the last remnants of her life with William. If they were lost, she and Nellie would be left with essentially nothing. "I think it best I take you straight to the platform, ma'am," the boy said. He had a startlingly deep voice with baritone notes that reminded Hazel of her late brother. "The train is due to arrive in 10 minutes. I assume you are bound for St. Louis, as it's the only train for hours." "Yes," she replied. On a whim, she added, "Unless the fare to St. Louis is only slightly less than the fare to Oregon, I have a little extra to change tickets." The young man's thin mouth slimmed into a rueful line, and he shook his head. "I don't think so, ma'am. A second-class ticket is $25 more than a first class to Missouri." "And third class?" she pressed, hopefully. "Only immigrants, drunks, and convicts go west by third class," he told her with a second headshake. "It's no place for a decent woman, and you don't want your little girl around those kinds of folks." His friendly caramel eyes drifted to Nellie, who was still clutching her mother's hand while looking around with a foggy gaze. "Besides, we won't have another train to Oregon for 4 days yet." Despite having known the unlikeliness of her request, Hazel still felt a wash of disappointment upon hearing his answer. Nevertheless, she thanked him quietly and allowed him to guide her to the platform that would soon be the last place she saw of Philadelphia. The train arrived in short order, and the boy waited with them until they were permitted to board. Hazel offered him 50 cents for his time and kindness, but he refused to accept more than a nickel. "If your intention is to go west, ma'am, I'd rather you keep it. I heard everything costs a pretty penny on the frontier, and I would rest easier knowing I did my Christian duty to lessen your struggles, even if only for a turn." Whether it was the weight of the sleepless night finally bearing down upon her, or the visceral resignation to her fate, or simply the boy's stoic generosity, Hazel did not know, but she felt a sudden burning in the depths of her throat. Her eyes tingled and her vision blurred, and a single blink sent a sneaky tear rolling down her cheek. She hastily brushed it away with her sleeve and whispered, "Thank you." The boy nodded politely, and there was a measure of understanding on his face for her emotional display that served only to ignite the esophageal burn into a painful sear, accompanied by several rotund droplets from her lashes. As he walked away with well wishes, Hazel realized she was not only terrified for the next chapter of her life, but also riddled with sorrow. She would miss Philadelphia terribly. Their luggage was taken to stow away safely, and they were shown to a long, narrow passenger car with rows of bench-like seats on either side and a skinny aisle between. There were sleeping quarters along a tight corridor to the right, each alcove with room enough only for 2 stacked single-person beds. But Hazel did not intend to make use of them. She did not care for the notion of sleeping in plain sight of the other travelers, and she could not imagine her prickling nerves allowing her to do so anyhow. Nellie would be suited well enough to stretch across one of the bench seats and slumber with her head in her mother's lap, should she get sleepy. It took nearly 20 minutes for the compartment to fill with others journeying to St. Louis, and another 10 for the ticket-taker to make his rounds. Hazel took interest in observing those who maneuvered past her, particularly the men. She looked not in a sinful fashion of lust and longing, but rather with curiosity and musing. Some of the men wore thick, dark beards, and some were clean-shaven and fresh-faced. One had eyes of such blueness that she was instantly put in mind of a cloudless summer sky. There were tall men and short men, and all sizes of belly and birth. With the arrival of each new male, she thought of the man in Missouri, the man who had answered her advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper with promises of venturing west after their wedding. It was he she would soon call husband, and it was he who would take her to Oregon. Chapter 3. It was only 6:30 on that Friday morning, but St. Louis streets were nearly swallowed by early rising city dwellers beginning their days as the sun winked over the horizon. Several buggies and twice as many horses clogged the train station curb, and one ruddy-coated mare in particular stomped her hoof and snorted loudly, agitated by the bustle. Elijah Crawford stroked the equine snout soothingly as he listened for the unmistakable wail of an incoming steam locomotive. He had only reattached the buggy to her some 20 minutes before, but already she seemed displeased with the burden of another day's travel. "Buck up, old girl," he told her quietly, pressing his forehead against her mane. "We've a much longer journey ahead of us soon enough." She huffed her disapproval, jowls flapping, but Elijah ignored the protest. He had his own reservations about what was to come. In his breast pocket was a letter, folded neatly and penned with an elegant hand. He was constantly reminded of its presence as much as its contents. Neither was outwardly unpleasant, but he preferred to pretend he had ventured all the way to St. Louis for any reason other than the truth. Ignoring the truth no longer remained in his realm of capabilities, however, as the deep bellow of the arriving train cut through the morning air. He offered his mare one more stroke of comfort down her nose, then checked to ensure she was properly tied to the post before meandering into the station with a leaping stomach. In mere moments now, he would lay eyes on his new bride-to-be for the first time. He recognized her immediately as she stepped out of the train, a traveling carpet bag held firmly in one hand and a wisp of a child held even more tightly in the other. She looked very much like the photograph she had sent, which was both a relief and a surprise, with smooth chestnut tresses, and she looked very much like the photograph she had sent, which was both a relief and a surprise, with smooth chestnut tresses and a graceful face that arced from her cheeks to her jaw before coming to a rounded point at the chin. Her clothes were clean and unwrinkled despite her journey, and while there was little in the way of glamour about her, she carried herself with an elegant esteem capable of captivating every man in the station. Even if he had not first seen a picture of her, he would have instinctively known this woman was Hazel Walker. Elijah approached her with caution, partially due to his demeanor and partially to avoid startling her. She met his gaze, and he saw her slender fingers tighten around her daughter's little hand. If he was any good at reading people, he would have assumed she was just as anxious about the meeting as him. "You are Elijah Crawford?" she asked, speaking before he had the opportunity. "Yes," he replied. It felt too formal to shake hands and too familiar to embrace, so they simply gazed at each other awkwardly. The child blinked groggily and ogled him with uncertainty. Finally, he extended a hand forward. "May I take your bag?" "Oh," Hazel said. She looked down at the carpet bag and shook her head dismissively. "I would much prefer assistance with our trunks, if you would be so gracious." "Of course." Elijah twisted on the spot to locate the boy unloading trunk after trunk onto the platform, grateful for something to do besides stand uncomfortably. By the time the buggy was laden with all of Hazel's worldly goods, the sun shimmered in the eastern sky and promised a clear weather day. The girl, Nellie, was nestled securely amongst the luggage in the buggy bed, and Hazel had settled herself onto the bench up front. With a tumbling in his belly, Elijah hoisted himself and took his place beside her. "Do we have a long journey back to Fredericktown?" Hazel asked. Her eyes were fixed unmovably on the mare's rotund rear, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elijah expected her to take interest in St. Louis, but she barely took notice of the activity around them as he wrapped his hands around the reins. Then again, Hazel was from Philadelphia. It was unlikely she was as unfamiliar with the constant movement of the city as he was. "Not terribly," he answered. "We shall arrive by nightfall. I've arranged accommodations for you with Annabelle Ray and her sister Francine, but others from the church have offered their homes as well, if you'd prefer." He was rambling to fill the otherwise silent space between them. Of course, Hazel would have no objections to staying with the Ray sisters, as she knew nothing of them or the surrounding area, but he felt it his duty to engage his fiancée in conversation. "Your arrangements will be fine, I'm sure," Hazel responded demurely. "It's only until Sunday, of course," Elijah hastily added. When she opted not to comment, he reluctantly allowed the quiet to permeate throughout the buggy, punctuated only by the mare's steady clip-clop along the street. Sunday was their wedding day. It was the day he would no longer be a widower, but a new husband, and it would be expected of him to behave as such. Even with Hazel sitting beside him and her little girl tucked into the back, Elijah was numb. In the coming days before his first wedding, he had been jittery and overexcited. When he had remained steadfast at his wife's side until she took her final breaths, he had been calm and strong for her sake. Now, however, he felt nothing. Hazel was beautiful, he simply could not deny that, and her daughter was sweet, but his emotions were as plain as if she was just another passerby in the busy St. Louis streets. "Where are your children?" Hazel asked suddenly, drawing his attention from his musings. Images of Timothy's and Calvin's faces bloomed in his mind to replace the morbid memory of their mother's last moments. "Timothy is preparing for school, I expect," he said. "I've asked Mrs. Sterling down the road to take them in during my absence, but it's quite likely Timothy insisted on washing up at home." "He sounds responsible," she replied. "He is," Elijah agreed. "He's a great deal like me at that age. Independent, you know. He doesn't like to ask help from anyone." Hazel's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Is your younger son very independent too?" "I think he enjoys imagining himself to be," Elijah said hesitantly. "But Calvin still needs someone. Losing their mother affected the boys differently. Timothy has taken an early leap into manhood, while Calvin seeks restitution for the affections he lost." His children were the reason Hazel was in his buggy now, on the way to Fredericktown. After a year of heavy consideration, Elijah had decided to take his boys out west, to Oregon. He told himself it was to better their lives, to farm the fertile land just as he had spent so many years doing in Missouri. But the truth was he also wanted to leave the home he had built with his late wife and start fresh. The memories of her were everywhere, and he mourned her each day as deeply as the evening she had passed. To take his young children on the long journey across the nation, however, required assistance, a motherly presence, and that was when he had stumbled upon Hazel's advertisement in the newspaper. She, too, was interested in traveling to Oregon, which he later learned was to reunite with her sister, and the union seemed fitting in its convenience. "What about your little one?" he questioned, jerking his head slightly back toward Nellie. The girl had not made a peep since disembarking the train. "Has she struggled with the loss of her father?" Hazel twisted her head to glance over her shoulder before responding. "She never knew him well enough, I don't think," she answered in a low tone. "She was so young when we lost him, and he was away in uniform for much of his life. I don't think she grieves him, but someday I am certain she will grieve what she never had." Elijah slackened the reins and allowed his gaze to slide sideways to the lovely widow. Even in speaking on such a morose topic, she was regal and unshaken. If he had not been a sorrow-stricken man, he knew he could have loved her. "And you?" he asked quietly. "Have you grieved?" For the first time since their proper meeting, their eyes locked. Hazel looked back at him with transparency behind her smoky orbs, and he felt a chip fall away from his fortressed heart. Her shapely lips parted to take in a small breath, and, when she replied, her voice was raw with emotion. "Yes," she said, "I still grieve. I don't think I'll ever stop." He knew the feeling all too well, and he tightened the mare's reins again as the crumbs of a newfound bond sprinkled over them. Chapter 4. The Ray sisters were a kindly duo, both gray-haired and zippy with energy. Francine chattered endlessly to Hazel about everything she could imagine, marriage and the Rays' lack thereof. "I wanted about to settle for a pig nose, no ma'am." Politics and the state of the government after the war. "I know you're a Yank, Mrs. Walker, but I think someone sticked their nose where it didn't belong, and that's how we ended up in this mess. The differences between children in Francine's day and the children of today." "Your daughter's right quiet, and I like me a quiet child, but the Kermit boys down the way ain't not but a bunch of heathens. And even Elijah. The Crawfords are a nice family, Mrs. Walker, but that Elijah ain't been the same since Helena died. I do hope you'll put some color back in his life, though your eyes are near as sad as his." Hazel did not often look at herself in the mirror and study her eyes, but before she retired to bed that evening in the Ray sisters' neat little guest room, she gazed long and hard at her reflection. Her eyes were indeed sad, the corners slightly downturned and the rims delicately pink. Though she had not wept recently, she wondered if Elijah had noticed, if it upset him to know she still yearned for her husband's return, but she realized it did not matter either way. He entered into the betrothal not in hopes of finding new love, but in the interest of securing a mother figure for his boys, and she had agreed solely for the purpose of relocating Nellie and herself to Oregon. It would be a marriage of convenience only, entirely sans emotion. The reddened edges around her eyes could remain so as long as she wished. She awoke on Saturday, just after the first morning light peeked over the horizon, and roused Nellie. The Missouri air in October was much warmer than in Philadelphia, but Hazel donned Nellie in her nicest dress despite the heat. "Are we going to see Pa?" Nellie asked, excited through her sleepy haze. Hazel nodded solemnly. "Yes, darling, today we will see Pa, and you can tell him all the things you want to tell him," she explained. The child squirmed as her somber-faced mother tugged on the dress's hem. "But you must be sure to say a proper goodbye, because we will be leaving Monday and Pa will be staying here." She slipped herself into a nice gown of her own, nicer perhaps than one she ordinarily would have worn to a simple field, but worth the occasion. They ventured to the kitchen, and Hazel fully expected to wait quietly for the sisters to arise. To her surprise, a full breakfast was already laid out across the table, and Annabelle was fluttering about. "I hope you're hungry," she grunted. Annabelle was much more forthright and certainly gruffer than her bubbly sister. "We ain't got a far trot ahead of us, but visiting graves is a taxing business, and you'll need your strength." Hazel quietly thanked the generous woman, and she tucked in with Nellie to the breakfast. The food was heavy on cream, butter, and oil, very different from Philadelphia, and it was delicious. Nevertheless, Hazel's stomach was rolling to and fro, and she found chewing difficult. She was anxious about today. Luckily, Annabelle was prepared to set off for the soldiers' resting place the moment the table was cleared and the dishes washed. "Francine ain't coming," she informed Hazel. "Last time she was at a gravesite, she went into a fit. Been years since she had seen our mother, but then Ma never did tolerate the weak of stomach very well. Is Mr. Crawford coming?" "No," Hazel said with a slight headshake. Elijah had told her the night before, as he helped her clamber from the buggy outside of the Ray sisters' home, that he would not see her until Sunday. He claimed he had a few outstanding tasks to take care of before they embarked for Oregon on Monday, but Hazel suspected he was actually trying to be respectful and give her time alone at her husband's final resting place. Whatever the case, she appreciated his consideration. "Probably for the best," Annabelle grunted. "It's been my experience the menfolk get awful jealous when they've got themselves another man to contend with, even if it's a dead un. To some, Annabel may have sounded crass and tactless, but Hazel was far from offended. On the contrary, she wholeheartedly agreed. Her approaching marriage to Elijah may have been one to suit the other's needs, yet it would have felt disrespectful to bring him along when she visited William's grave for the first and last time. The field they drove to was lush and sprawling, with waist-high grasses that swayed in the mid-autumn wind and whispered condolences. Thick forest lined the expanse on two sides, dark and shadowed against the green and gold spread, and the dirt road upon which they traveled lined the third. The fourth and final side was marked by a house and several barns in the distance. "This is Darrow Mazer's farm," Annabel informed her as they creaked along the dusty path, the aged horse wheezing uncomfortably as it pulled them. "His son was killed in the war, too. That's why he didn't agree to let them bury the bodies in his soil, on account of his son. It's right pretty, but I don't think corpses make good fertilizer myself." It was not difficult to locate the burial site. The thick grasses flowing out before them disappeared suddenly as they dropped into a shallow dell and gave way to small emerald blades much like a standard lawn. From the road to the trees, small hills engorged the ground, one after the other in neat rows. There were no markers, no headstones or identifiers of any kind, but Hazel would have known even if she had never been told that these were the graves of many, many men. In the buggy bed behind her, she heard Nellie counting under her breath. "I see 54, Nellie announced with pride. She pointed brazenly out over the field. "Ma, there's 54 hills." Thus far, Hazel had not struggled to explain death to Nellie, nor to explain the reasons behind her father's absence. Now, however, tears pricked the inners of her eyes, and she could do little more than nod and croak, "Very good, darling." "Where's Pa?" the child continued, craning her neck and widening her eyes in hopes of glimpsing a waiting someone. Hazel breathed in a shuddery breath. Annabel made a noise in her throat. When the younger woman glanced at the older one, she was surprised to see sorrow creasing the time-wrinkled face. "I'll stay here," Annabel said hoarsely. "Gotta keep the horse calm. She's gotten skittish over the years. Take the time you need for yourself and your daughter. I ain't in no kind of rush." Hazel nodded and climbed from the buggy, then leaned to lift Nellie from the back and place the girl down beside her. Nellie's eyes were still wide, flinging from side to side and taking in the view of the field with zealous interest. Hazel took her daughter's hand, and they strode from the dirt path onto the grass. "Where's Pa?" Nellie asked again. "I'm not certain," Hazel replied quietly. She was holding the youngster's hand a little more firmly than she ordinarily would have out of sheer nerves, and she swung her gaze from one bump in the ground to another as if expecting to find a sign indicating William's place. There were none, and she came to a stop in the very center between the two rows, the humps of soil and budded foliage surrounding them. Bending until she was face to face with Nellie, she murmured, "Darling, Pa is here. You cannot see him, but he's here." "He's with God," Nellie noted. "Yes, he's with God," the chestnut-held widow confirmed gently. "Pa's spirit is with God, but his body is here. Do you want to say anything to him?" Nellie hesitated. She was a pious little girl, eager to learn at church and well-versed in prayer, and Hazel knew this moment was unorthodox and confusing for her young child. A delicate breeze wafted across the space, ruffling the grass and Nellie's skirts, and the girl seemed to perk up. She tilted her face toward the sky, and in a loud, clear voice, she said, "Hello, Pa. I miss you. Mama says you're with God now, and I hope you're saying your prayers." Hazel smiled as tears again stuck in her eyes. Her chin trembled slightly as she listened to her daughter's innocent expressions. "I'm taking real good care of Ma. She's sad sometimes, and I make her happy. Ma misses you too." A hard, thick bump swelled in Hazel's throat, and she straightened up to prevent Nellie from witnessing her grief. Though it felt blasphemous to feel so, she felt closer to William amongst the grave sites than she had since learning of his passing a year before. His presence was all around her. She breathed him in with each inhale and smelled him in the wind. Not for the first time, but certainly with the most intensity. She ached with the need to feel his arms around her once again. "I think it will be fun. I wish you could come, but if you're with God, I suppose you'll be there. Ma says you're with me all the time. I just wish I could see you, Pa." Nellie turned her face up to her mother. "I guess I'm done, Ma," she said. Hazel ran her fingers through Nellie's thin locks and nodded. "Why don't you find some flowers to pick?" she suggested. "I'm going to speak with Pa now." Nellie skipped away, treading carelessly over the unmarked graves and kicking her dress up toward her knees. Hazel watched her go, and when she was certain the little girl was out of earshot, she shakily began to talk aloud. "I miss you dearly, William. I know you're in heaven and needn't be bothered with the trivialities of a yearning heart, but every day feels as raw as the day I learned I lost you." A sob unburdened itself from her diaphragm and rolled from between her lips. "You were a wonderful man, William, and a wonderful father, and you were the ideal husband." The tears were flowing freely now, springing down her cheeks like rain from cloudy skies. She failed to wipe them away and permitted them to saturate the collar of her dress. "I do not resent you, William. I need you to know that. My marriage to Elijah Crawford is far from a replacement for you. I intend to have it annulled once we reach Oregon. I would not bother at all but for Nellie, and it would be sinful to travel with a single man and his children without a wedding. Elijah seems a nice enough man. He merely wants a mother for his boys, and I am glad to be so during the journey." Her knees quaked beneath her skirts, and she wanted to drop to the ground. The grass was dewy, though, and the dress was only one of 2 formal gowns she had not sold for fare to Missouri, so she forced herself to remain standing. "I will always love you. You have my heart forever and always, but I must do this if our daughter is to have any kind of future. Please forgive me, William. Please know I am still yours." Chapter 5. The day had come, the day in which Mrs. Hazel Walker would relinquish her legal status as widow and become Mrs. Hazel Crawford. Her insides were tumbling about like clothes in a washtub, and her palms were clammy with feverish nerves. She was clumsy as she moved through the guest room and prepared herself. The thick bristled hairbrush slipped from her fingers more than once, and she nearly tore the hem of her gown as she tripped over her own feet. Nellie sat silently on the bed with her hands folded and her eyes glossy with childish daydreams, but Hazel repeatedly asked if her daughter felt quite well. The child responded positively, and the glossy-haired bride was forced to acknowledge the anxiety was all her own. "I ain't one who compliments much with the poor modesty of women these days, but you're quite lovely, Mrs. Walker," Annabel said when Hazel entered the kitchen. Annabel was always in the kitchen, it seemed, either making the next meal or adding to her bulk store of preserves. After the foray to the field where William rested, she had softened considerably, and Hazel found the elderly woman a delightful companion beneath the gruffness. "Thank you," Hazel responded politely. She forced her tone into flat monotony for fear of revealing her quaking innards within her words, but Annabel eyed her knowingly. "Samantha Sterling came to call nearly an hour ago," she went on. "She's been watching the Crawford boys a lot lately, you know, while their pa fixes to take y'all west. She said he's ready as soon as you are." Again, Hazel's belly flipped. She looked at Nellie, who was cheerfully chewing a thick slab of bread with jam. Part of her wanted to scoop the girl up and return to Philadelphia with the hope they could find a way to survive, but she knew better. Oregon was her only choice, and she had to marry Elijah today. "I'm ready," she murmured. As Elijah drove her directly to the Ray sisters' house on the outskirts of Fredericktown from St. Louis, Hazel had never seen his home before. She was startled by the splendor. There was nothing glamorous or exquisite about the comfortable 2-bedroom house, but it was breathtaking in its own right. The walls were clean and whitewashed, the windows shiny and transparent with painted shutters on either side of each. Flower beds lined the entire footprint of the home and sprouted in petals of reds, yellows, and purples. The lawn was both wide and long and stretched to the boundaries of neighboring farmland, and behind the property lay forests of similar beauty to those which bordered William's grave. With a canopy of turquoise sky overhead, the sight was nothing short of picturesque. Nellie was alight with thrill. She watched butterflies flutter from the crabapple trees to the hydrangeas and giggled loudly as she spotted a chipmunk racing across the yard. Their home in Philadelphia had lacked these delightful simplicities of nature, and while Hazel found it peaceful and soothing, Nellie was utterly twitching with excitement. "Ma, can I go play with—" "Hush, child," Francine chided. Francine had tagged along this time and was as bouncy as ever. Despite her spoken disdain for modern children, she gladly accepted the responsibility of tending to Nellie during the services, and Hazel was left to herself at the farthest corner of the expansive yard, while Francine ushered the girl toward the arranged seats. The wedding was to take place outdoors on Elijah's property. Hazel would have preferred to be married in a church, but she made no complaints. It would be easier, she reasoned, to annul the marriage upon settling in Oregon if the vows were not taken in the sanctity of God's house. She had yet to lay eyes upon Elijah as he was still inside with his children, but she did not feel alone. William was with her, she was certain. A bang wrenched her to the present. The screen door slammed against the jamb, and she watched two boys emerge. One was a head taller than the other, and he strode with restraint, much like a grown man. The shorter of the two, on the other hand, was all hops and skips. He lifted himself onto the balls of his feet with each step and came down flat-footed to give him the appearance of an overactive mole poking his head from the earth. Hazel flicked her gaze to Nellie, who was now seated on one of the benches set out for the service beside Francine. The little girl was watching the boys with interest, particularly focusing on the youngest. Hazel hoped it boded well that Nellie would accept her new brothers, at least for the time being. There was a second bang, but this one was softer and less raucous. She looked back to the house and saw Elijah stepping down the path toward the open space where she would soon join him. He was certainly handsome. When he fetched her from the train station in St. Louis, he had spent a number of hours traveling and was wearing comfortable clothes for the journey. Now, however, his hair was combed and washed, his face clear of dust from the roads, and he wore a finely tailored suit. She was able to see the supple angles of his face and the masculinity in his ridged brow. His form, now erect rather than hunched on a buggy seat, was tall and sturdy and respectably muscled from years of manual labor. Curls of dark hair twisted at the nape of his neck, matched by his dark eyebrows and even darker lashes. In short, he was as visually appealing as any woman could hope to wed. Yet, Hazel was unable to shake the lightness in her head and the thick knot in her gut. She wrung her hands, twisting her fingers into the swaths of her skirt, before remembering she needed to avoid causing wrinkles. This was it, the final moments of widowhood. A gentle gust breathed across her cheeks, and she swallowed hard. A rather stocky minister ambled from behind the house with a well-worn Bible clutched in his ancient hands. He looked frail and vulnerable, and Hazel found herself actually wondering if he would even be capable of performing the ceremony. It was evident by the smiles and nods and exchanged words that all present were very familiar with the aged man. Hazel felt a burst of homesickness. Elijah knew the people here, his children, the minister, the Ray sisters, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, and a man in his mid-30s accompanied by a queenly woman with raven black hair. But she was alone, with only Nellie as a comforting face. She reminded herself that her homesickness was short-lived. Soon she would be with her sister. Suddenly, through the breeze, a soft melody alit on Hazel's ears. She realized the beautiful black-hailed woman with the unknown man was standing, and to her lips was pressed a song flute. The tune was unique in its lilts and tinny, but it was lovely and uplifting. Hazel felt a swelling of confidence within her as she listened. Then she took her first step toward Elijah. His eyes locked onto hers, and the succeeding steps came easier and easier until she was barely aware she was walking. When she drew up to him, standing before the minister and the congregation of onlookers, they gazed unabashedly into each other's faces. She knew not what expression she wore, but Elijah's was one of startled delight. "You are beautiful," he whispered. His words were audible only to her, but she felt as if the entire world could hear his praise, and her cheeks flamed. "Thank you," she whispered in response, lowering her eyes in gratitude. The minister cleared his throat, a loud groaning sound capable of jostling the deepest dreamer from slumber. "I trust we are ready to begin," he gurgled, with a glance between the pair. Hazel raised her gaze again, and she found Elijah staring unblinkingly back at her. "Yes," he said. His voice was rich with confidence, as Hazel had felt upon hearing the lovely woman's song flute music, and it exhilarated her. The corners of her lips turned up, and Elijah said, "Please begin, Minister." Chapter 6. The sky was still navy and pinpricked with silvery stars. As Elijah shoved the last trunk into the wagon, it split through the still silence with a groan, scraping against the wood and grunting when it met its pile of counterparts. There was a small space at the front of the bed laden with blankets where the children would sit during the journey when they grew too tired to walk. But the rest of the wagon was cramped with a few trunks of clothing and sentimental possessions, spare wagon parts, several boxes of tools and weapons, and more food than seemed consumable. To assemble a wagon train in October and make the journey to Oregon through the winter was not only unorthodox but also extraordinarily dangerous, and it required an excessive amount of food for both humans and oxen. Sacks of flour and sugar and coffee stacked against the wagon's sides, held into place by crates laden with pickled vegetables and jarred fruits. The savory aroma of salted meat permeated the space beneath the cotton canopy to prick the nostrils and water the tongue. Barrels of supplemental feed for the oxen, once they met winter's desolation, occupied the centermost portion of the bed. As he stood back and took a final look, Elijah realized he had more than he could have imagined, but he knew it still would not be enough to see their travels through. They would have to hope they could pass through townships along the way with timeliness and avoid crossing paths with thieving bandits. "Pa!" Elijah turned around to see the waist-high, tow-headed Calvin racing toward him through the darkness. The child was fully dressed, likely with the help of his brother, and held a bun in each hand. When he drew up, he extended one to his father, who took it gratefully. "I didn't expect you up for a bit yet," he said to his son. "I got up 'cause I heard Frank and Figgy," Calvin replied, throwing an affectionate glance at the hitched oxen. His azure eyes sparkled as brightly as the stars above, which were only beginning to fade at the onset of dawn. "Mother's up too. She gave me this." He lifted the bun and took a large bite, and Elijah watched him with a pang in his chest. Since the wedding yesterday, Calvin had easily adopted Hazel as mother. While the children's approval of his new bride was certainly a blessing, Elijah could not stop the twinge of sorrow that plummeted through him each time he heard the title. For so long, it had been one dedicated solely to his late wife, his beloved Helena. Timothy still held the term back with reservation, preferring to address Hazel by name thus far, but it flowed so readily from Calvin's lips that Elijah wondered if the boy had any grief left, or if he was without memory of Helena altogether. Either way, the man did not begrudge the 4-year-old and smiled gently. "Is Timothy awake?" he asked. Calvin nodded and swung his gaze to the wagon. "Pa, can I get in?" "Not yet. We must wait for Dr. Taylor to arrive." Davis Taylor was a middle-aged doctor who had moved to Fredericktown less than a year prior. He had spent his many months boarding with the Dyer family, but now he would become the proud owner of the house and property the moment Elijah turned over the deed to him. "You needn't be so eager anyway, boy. You'll be sitting long enough very soon." "No, I won't," Calvin announced stoutly, puffing out his little chest. "I'm going to walk with everyone else. Billy Mercer said his cousin walked the whole way to Oregon when his family went last spring, and Billy's cousin's younger than me." "Billy Mercer is telling you stories," Elijah sternly said. "Anyway, I'd think you'd have better sense than to risk your health for the sake of pride." Calvin squirmed uncomfortably. "Well, maybe that's right," he conceded, "but I still want to walk some of the way." Elijah chuckled, but his attention was diverted by a silhouette strolling out of the house toward him. Hazel padded across the yard with her carpet bag in her hands. He heard her skirts swishing against the grass as she moved, and he was struck by the grace of her gait. Her pale skin glowed with a pearlescent aura in the dim morn. No matter the convenience their wedding appropriated to each of them, he could not deny her beauty, and it continued to awe him at the most unexpected of times. "I believe the doctor is coming," she said, in her calm, melodious voice. "I saw a man on horseback from the kitchen window." "Good," Elijah returned. "I trust you are ready to leave shortly, then?" "Everyone is ready," Hazel confirmed. The sound of distant clip-clopping hooves met her final syllable, and she rested a hand on Calvin's shoulders. "Come, darling, let's not disturb your father while he conducts business." As she guided the boy back toward the house, Elijah was left alone with the wagon once more to await Dr. Taylor's arrival. He watched his new wife and his son together with their hands joined, and a slight tingling of warmth spread throughout his fingers. While he imagined he would spend the rest of his days mourning Helena, it seemed he had chosen the right woman to take her place. The first leg of the long trip to Oregon was simply across the state of Missouri from Fredericktown to Independence. But it was not a brief dawn to dusk or dusk to dawn journey as it had been for Elijah when he ventured to St. Louis to retrieve Hazel from the train station. On the contrary, it was slow, plodding, and endless. With a wagon loaded to the hilt with foodstuffs and their worldly items, the oxen were unable to trot along at the speed of the mare, which Elijah had sold to the good doctor along with the property, and instead merely thudded along at a leisurely pace. It was not difficult to keep stride with them, but it was a great deal more mentally taxing than the able man had anticipated. The first several days were not wholly unpleasant. The children were excited, and Calvin, too, was more exuberant than others and gladly strode alongside the adults. Bright sunshine split through the aquamarine sky each morning and bathed them in comfortable rays until evening, as delicate autumn breezes kissed their lashes, and the tent shared by the family in which to slumber each night was warm and relatively comfortable. The stretching landscape of fields laden with yellow Indian grass and Queen Anne's lace was one of beauty and serenity that lent itself nicely to the uncertain silence between Elijah and his new bride, for they exchanged few words and tended only to meet eyes at unpredictable intervals. Often he found himself searching for something to say to Hazel as he felt rude in keeping quiet, but he knew not what he ought to speak about, and instead resigned himself to imagining conversation. The fact was, Hazel was little more than a stranger to him, perhaps a kind of acquaintance. Their marriage had not bequeathed them with the familiarities of a couple who wed after months or years of courting. Nevertheless, discussion was limited only to the children and their travels. Elijah was pleased with her company. After a week passed, however, and they were halfway through their journey to Independence, things took a turn. They met with their first rainstorm, one so intense even Nellie and Calvin were drenched from head to toe despite being tucked into the wagon. The first hints of winter snapped in the gusts of wind and chilled Hazel's cheeks to a rosy pink, and Timothy strained his ankle in a sticky glop of thick mud. The day after the storm was so unseasonably warm that it felt as if a sweltering blanket of humidity had been lain upon them. Elijah's heels throbbed with puckered blisters, and he was becoming more reserved by the passing hour. Part of the difficulty, he knew, was that they were traveling alone. Once they joined the wagon train, they would encounter new faces and like-minded comrades who would sympathize and support them. In the meantime, though, he was aching and grumpy, and constantly berating himself for leaving his new wife with nothing more than her own thoughts as a distraction from the hardships of the journey. Finally, he was unable to pity himself any longer. On the 11th night, as the children slept in the tent shared by the whole family, while he and Hazel secured the wagon's canopy in case of another storm overnight, Elijah paused. "I must apologize to you," he said. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her in nearly 2 days, and she was startled. "Whatever for?" she asked, eyes wide. He leaned against the wagon, dropping the flap of the cotton cover in his hands to fold his arms. "I've been less than courteous," he explained. He rather sheepishly scuffed the dirt with the toe of his boot. "I've barely spoken a paragraph to you since our wedding. You deserve better." Hazel eyed him thoughtfully and sagely pointed out, "I have not said much to you either." "No, but I am head of this family. It is my responsibility to set an example," Elijah combated. She continued to look at him, and he felt examined beneath her analytic gaze. Yet he was not uncomfortable. On the contrary, he realized he quite enjoyed the direct attention from her, without interruption from the children. Perhaps the isolation from society had taken a greater toll on him than he had thought. "Let's make an agreement then," Hazel suggested finally, her tone diplomatic and confident. "We shall say what's in our minds when it appears there, no matter how silly or foolish or bold it may be, minding what is said before the children, of course." "Of course," Elijah murmured. He was watching her mouth as she spoke, observing the whimsical way her beautifully sculpted upper lip rested flush against her plump lower lip as she spoke her words. Shaking himself into reality again, he repeated a little louder, "Of course, I agree. We will speak when a thought strikes us." "Good." An approving smile lit her mouth, and he was again drawn to the artistry of her lips. He had not kissed her since the wedding, and that had been merely a polite peck. Now, beneath the moonlight, with only the rustling fields as a witness, he felt an urging within himself to close the gap between them and crush his mouth to hers. But he did not. Instead, he seized the cover flap again and resumed securing the wagon, and Hazel assisted him. They had an agreement to communicate, which was perhaps awkward and far from romantic, but it was a step toward properly acquainting themselves with one another, and that would have to do. Chapter 7. For over 2 weeks, Hazel had seen nothing but nature and her new family. As they rode up on the mass of wagons gathered just west of Independence, it was as if she was seeing civilization for the first time. Her heart began to thump heavily at the base of her throat, and she darted her eyes from face to face in search of a single kindred soul. The pressures of organized society rained down upon her once more in the presence of others. All at once she was concerned about the state of her dress and flushed with shame that she had not washed behind her ears in days. On the bright side, what had begun as an uncomfortable journey with a fairly unfamiliar man had manifested into a path of learning about her new husband. Elijah was fascinating to her, not in the least because their upbringings were so different. The last few days of their trip across Missouri were spent with tales of his boyhood as a farmer's son, which she countered at his request with stories of growing up in the city. They did not discuss their late spouses, but it was no source of contention, and the only moments of silence that fell were to catch a breath or drift to sleep. The children, too, seemed to flourish beneath their parents' newfound friendship, and Hazel watched with delight as Nellie fluttered about the ditches and fields with Calvin. Only Timothy remained buttoned up and quiet, choosing to stride alongside the wagon without speaking unless addressed, rather than to play with the younger two. He was not but 8 years, yet he already had an air of manhood about him that left Hazel uncertain about her role. He refused to ask her help for anything, though he followed her commands without complaint, and while Calvin cheerfully referred to her as mother, Timothy insisted on calling her Hazel. More often than not, she felt as though the serious-faced child thought her more of a nuisance than a stepmother. Nevertheless, she continued to look after him with attentive kindness, and they were overall a happy family. "I've a friend we'll be meeting," Elijah said as they neared the cluster of people, cattle, and wagons. Hazel was nearly breathless with awe at the sight of so many cotton canopies in one place, let alone the low rumble of chatter from the many voices. But she attempted to focus on Elijah as he spoke. "He, too, plans to farm in Oregon. In fact, it was he who convinced me to join the train." "Oh," she responded rather absently. She counted 11 wagons, making them the 12th, and there was the possibility that more would be arriving. The number surprised her. After all, wagon trains typically only gathered in spring. They would be traveling through the winter, something she expected with very few participants. He has a boy around Timothy's age, and a wife, of course, Elijah continued. I believe you will get on well with her. At this, Hazel paid slightly closer attention. She was enjoying her time with Elijah now that they were speaking regularly rather than avoiding conversation out of discomfort. But the notion of having a friend throughout the next few months, which was certain to be at least a bit troublesome, was soothing. She had only 2 friends back in Philadelphia, and it was likely she would never see either one of them again. To think she could make another now held a lilt of exciting promise. Ma. Nellie tugged on Hazel's arm, and the brunette-headed woman looked down at her daughter. Surprisingly, Nellie had not tired early into the trip as Hazel had expected. The little girl was happy to trudge beside her mother for several hours at a time when she was not playing with Calvin. Who are all these people? Hazel opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Elijah bent and scooped the child up into his arms. They are going to Oregon with us, he explained. We travel together so we can help each other. Nellie had finally taken to Elijah several days earlier, and her face lit up as he carried her. Children, too? She asked with wide, hopeful eyes. Oh, yes, Elijah told her solemnly. He hoisted her higher until her shoes were level with his shoulders. Don't you see them all? Hazel watched as Nellie surveyed the scene nearing before them from the heightened vantage point. Not an ounce of fear shadowed the little one's innocent face, so unlike the Nellie of yore, but a welcome change nonetheless. Goodness, the girl exclaimed, eliciting a smile of amusement from her mother. Since spending so much time in Timothy's presence, Nellie had taken to comporting herself with unusual maturity at the most unexpected of times. Hazel knew the behavior was born of a desire to impress the stern-faced lad of 8. Though it appeared Nellie had little more luck than Hazel in earning the boy's affections, as he tended to ignore the child completely. Elijah lowered her carefully to the ground again, pausing for a mere moment to allow her to regain her balance before resuming his steady stride. With a shriek of thrill, Nellie tore off toward the ditch where Calvin was galloping like a horse, and the adults were left alone again as Timothy had taken point by the oxen. Are you worried at all? Hazel inquired of Elijah once Calvin and Nellie were out of earshot. She fell into step beside him, a difficult feat to be sure, as his legs were quite longer than hers and he had the freedom of trousers while she had to avoid tangling her shoes in her skirts. For the children? He asked. She tilted her head. Well, yes, but more so for the dangers we are likely to soon face. Nearly 100 died in the last wagon train journey, and they left in the spring. I read so in the paper. I am, Elijah admitted, but much of my concern is due to unpreparedness. I expect you're better suited for what is to come. How can you be certain? Hazel asked in surprised confusion. Elijah looked at her, his eyes as brightly blue as Calvin's, and rather magnetic in their appeal. You've weathered winters much harsher than I. It is my understanding that Philadelphia experiences its share of blizzards and ice storms, yes? A share enough, I suppose, Hazel murmured in reply. And you've certainly lived in closer quarters to others than I, he went on. In fact, save for my comfort out of doors, I'd wager you manage more than a mite better than I in the next coming months. She smiled, and Elijah returned with one of his own. He was so handsome when he was as stony-faced as his eldest son, but he was very nearly breathtaking when he smiled. The corners of his eyes lifted slightly as his lips did the same. His cheekbones rose to freshen his visage, and the sharp angles of his masculine jaw pulsed almost imperceptibly with whispers of restrained playfulness. His well-tanned skin from his many years of working beneath the relentless sun utterly glowed when he smiled. Hazel felt a small swoop in her belly at the sight. Elijah Crawford. The voice cut through the sounds of the gathered wagons and their owners, drawing the attention of both Hazel and her bridegroom. She spotted a man jogging toward them with neither oxen nor family behind him. For a split second, she feared he was one of the crooks she had heard much about, the swindlers who targeted westbound travelers, but Elijah's smile turned to calm recognition, and the sudden knot in her stomach eased. The man drew near enough to speak more normally, and he slowed to a walk. He was a strange-looking person, to say the least. A mop of ruddy hair flowed in tangled strands to his waist, around which he wore a belt laden with small hammers and mallets, a miniature axe, and every other kind of hand tool available. Creases bordered his eyes, which were boggy green, and his cheeks appeared sunken despite their rosy hue. A vest of deerskin hung limply around his slender torso and mostly hid the dust-caked shirt beneath, the sleeves of which he had rolled up to his elbows. This man reminded Hazel greatly of the pictures of trade merchants from the Appalachians she had seen when a traveling photographer had come to Philadelphia for an exhibition. "You're a day late," the man said, not accusingly. "We expected you around noontime yesterday. Met with some trouble, did ya?" "We experienced a terrible rainstorm, and we weren't yet accustomed to traveling such a distance," Elijah informed him. He turned to Hazel and rested his hand on the small of her back, the first intimate touch they had shared since the wedding. She felt a shiver run up her spine as he gestured toward the eccentric male before them. "Hazel, please meet Jebediah Monk. Jeb, my new wife." "Mrs. Crawford," Jeb said cordially, lowering his head in polite greeting. He was surprisingly gentlemanly despite his rugged appearance. "I do hope this man's been treating you like a lady, eh?" "Indeed," Hazel responded. She too inclined her head, though she swiveled her eyes to ensure Nellie and Calvin were still within view. Jeb jerked his head backward, and Hazel heard his neck crackle with protest. "Wagon's back, Attaway. Lillian's made cornbread, and we've got us some preserves to share. Why don't you bring your schooner round and tuck up with us? Patty'll be glad for a playmate or three." Elijah agreed and thanked him, and the wild-hailed man jogged away. Hazel eyed her husband with amusement. "He's quite the character," she commented lightly. "Yes," Elijah nodded, "but he's a good friend and right handy. Lillian's a little more ordinary than he, though I do emphasize the phrase a little more." Hazel glanced back at the children again and made a broad, sweeping motion with her hand to summon them to her. "In any case, it's nice to have allies as we take on whatever is to come," she said. "I feel better, protected." Elijah stopped walking, and she stopped as well, with curiosity. He faced her directly, and his hand twitched as if he meant to lift it and take her chin. He refrained, but his gaze was so piercing it gripped her just as powerfully as would his fingers. She was unable to blink beneath his penetrating stare, unable to breathe. "Hazel," he said. His voice was so low it was barely audible through the cacophony of chatter and laughter and groaning oxen, but she heard him at her very core. "You need never believe you are unprotected. As your husband, it is my duty to provide and protect, and you can be sure I intend to do so. I would go to the ends of the earth to ensure it." Though it was a proclamation of his dedication to his role rather than a declaration of love, it still carried with it a great weight of compassion that broke through the superficial and clawed into Hazel's soul. She stared up at him as he spoke, in awe of his apparent commitment to her. She knew he still pined for his late spouse, as she pined for hers, but she was learning to trust in Elijah's goodness and rely on his companionship every day, and as she absorbed his words of promise, she believed him. Chapter 8. Elijah was correct in his assumption that Hazel would like Lillian very much. Jeb's wife was a petite thing, standing only just above Hazel's shoulders, but she was rife with spunk and positivity. She reminded Hazel of a porcelain doll with her large, wide eyes and pink cheeks and delicate form. Yet she was alive with a personality that set those around her at ease in mere moments. Upon being introduced to Lillian, Hazel found herself pulled into a kind embrace, before being tugged to a small fire, over which crackled a hearty slab of bacon. "Oh, do eat with us," Lillian wheedled. "We've so much food, cornbread, bacon, and preserves, and I do hate waste so." Hazel agreed to the request, of course, and she found herself quite amused throughout the lunch. Lillian was not shy about conversation and fairly talked Hazel's ear off, which the new bride enjoyed immensely. She learned she had been correct in her analysis of Jeb as a mountain man, for he and Lillian were native to the Appalachians of North Carolina and had only moved to Missouri 2 years ago. The charismatic little nymph practically bounced on her rear with excitement as she told Hazel of their humble one-room cottage and the sight of the sun rising over the towering peaks each morning. She was so vivid in her descriptions, in fact, that Hazel began to long for the mountains, as if she had spent most of her life there, and she could easily picture the peppy, golden-hailed Lillian traipsing through evergreens in search of wild berries. By the time night fell, Hazel considered Lillian a lovely friend and Jeb utterly intriguing. She was delighted to watch Elijah speaking animatedly with the untamed man, and she listened intently as Jeb recalled some of his more outlandish mountain-like escapades that were likely to be an asset during their pending journey, including the time he came face to face with a territorial black bear and was forced to shoot it squarely between the eyes to escape. He recruited 20 men from town to help him carry the beast back, and he shared the meat evenly amongst everyone, Lillian proudly interjected. The love between the quirky couple was all too evident simply in the meaningful looks they offered one another through the orange firelight, and, though Hazel thought herself merely fond of Elijah in the friendliest way, she felt pleasure to be in the company of such a love. The next morning, Hazel awoke to a ruckus of clatters and grunts and thuds and shouts. She emerged from the family tent to find all the males in the wagon camp, Elijah amongst them, hitching oxen and restacking goods in the beds. Men with older sons were calling to each other loudly as they worked, while those without moved between wagons to help one another. Several women milled about as well, either wrangling children or assisting their husbands in whatever way they were able. It was a scene of organized chaos, and Hazel's heart leaped with excitement. "Good morning," Elijah said to her as she neared their wagon. He was standing in the back piling fallen sacks back into place, but he hopped down to greet her. "Good morning," Hazel replied. She swiveled her eyes around. "We are leaving?" "Very soon, yes." Elijah bent forward and kissed her cheek delicately. Hazel flushed, having last been kissed by him at their wedding, but she did not recoil. On the contrary, an involuntary smile flooded her lips. There was something comforting in their tentative relationship, and she was not displeased by the fluttering in her belly. "I suppose I ought to rouse the children then," she said with mustard casualness. Elijah nodded. "Lillian has already begun breakfast, and she's asked me to send you to her once you awoke. We will eat with them this morning. Make certain Nellie, Calvin, and Timothy eat well, for we will be traveling through Kansas and Nebraska for nearly 2 months, and won't be able to replenish our stock of foodstuffs until we reach Fort Laramie, so this will be the last meal without ration." Luckily, the day was already a fine one. It was a sunny Wednesday morning, puffy white clouds drifting lazily across the sky, and the temperature was quite comfortable, although that likely indicated they would be too warm when the sun was at its highest in the afternoon. Hazel bustled back to the tent and woke the children, helped the youngest 2 dress, then wandered to the next wagon over from theirs, where Lillian was crouching beside the fire. "I've a surprise for you," the peppery woman cried the moment her eyes met Hazel's ear. She hopped up and trounced to a satchel near her dismantled tent. Digging briefly through its contents, she straightened up again and held out a small, furry paw. Hazel nearly jumped back in alarm and stared at the item. "Is that a foot?" she asked hesitantly. Lillian nodded eagerly. "A rabbit's foot," she said, brandishing it outward. Again, Hazel had to resist the urge to jump backward. "It's for good luck." "Isn't that evil?" Hazel questioned tentatively. "I've heard lucky rabbits' feet are dark magic." With a chuckle, Lillian shook her head and replied, "Only if witches put charms on them. This one is just a symbol. It's from a rabbit Jeb caught for supper before we came to Independence." Hazel took the foot, holding it gingerly between her thumb and forefinger. She understood now why Elijah had specified that Lillian was only a little more ordinary than Jeb, but the unusual token did nothing to dilute Hazel's friendly opinion of the petite woman. After breakfast, there was another ado about the camp as the wagons were loaded to completion and families rounded up. In total, there were 15 groups traveling in the train, counting Hazel's, which sounded like a small number but was actually rather stunning. Hazel never would have imagined so many people willing to make the rugged journey across the country through the depths of winter, but it seemed most had the same mindset as Elijah. They wanted to reach Oregon in time to sow the season's crops. Only one couple, a childless pair, intended to splinter off from the train in pursuit of California, but the rest would remain to see out the trip to Oregon. "We will be fanning out," Elijah told Hazel as they began to walk. The oxen were unusually energetic, likely due to the thick patch of greenery they had been herded to overnight, and they seemed intent on clomping along faster than Elijah would allow. A wagon of 3 brothers was trundling in front of them, and they needed to remain a reasonable distance behind to prevent being choked and blinded by dust. "Most of the trail for the first few days is flat land, so we'll have plenty of room to have our own space without separating." She nodded, and her fingers absently brushed over the soft fur of the rabbit foot she had tucked into her skirt pocket. The trip from Fredericktown to Independence had been a mild ordeal of sorts, a very strange experience, but she was finally realizing this was the beginning of a journey across the country on foot. Her resolve wavered for the briefest of moments. Elijah leaned forward a bit to peer into her face without breaking his stride. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, as if she had any choice. Hazel looked back at him. He was so stoically handsome, she could hardly believe it had been him and not a gremlin of a man who responded to her advertisement. His eyes were riddled with genuine concern for her, and his mouth was opened just slightly. As he walked, his shoulders held straight and his strong arms swayed. Yet her admiration was haunted by the ghosts of her past and her future. William's face swam before her mind's eye, equally as handsome as Elijah's, but perhaps a bit more refined in its slender cheeks and sculpted chin. Throughout his year in service and during his passing time, she had maintained a very clear image of him, as clear as if he had stood just before her and gazed into her eyes. Every morning and every night, as she rose from or retired to bed, she recalled his face and memorized it over again. Strangely, it seemed faded now, less vivid in its hues and silhouette. He came to her no longer as a manifestation of his true self, but as a photograph and a memory. For several days she had tried and tried twice to reclaim his realism, but, either due to exhaustion from her adventure or guilt for Elijah's new place in her life, William had somehow turned into the likes of a painting, beautiful and beloved, but detached from the world. She stared at the man walking beside her, the man who had vowed to keep her safe and had won Nellie's heart. It pained her to think of what would become of them when they reached Oregon. She had given him no inkling of her plans to annul the marriage, and though she had told him of her sister, and he had promised to find a stead near enough for regular visits, Hazel still intended to take herself and Nellie to live with her family rather than Elijah. Their wedding may have been one of convenience, but already they had come to rely on one another more than she had expected. His heart was already broken, buried in the grave with Helena. But would she end up breaking his spirit too? Hazel swallowed hard, tamping the guilt within her back into the shadows, and nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." Chapter 9. Hazel soon discovered that wagon trains were much less like trains than she had thought, and much more like turkey tails or herds of wild buffalo. Elijah's description of fanning out had been extremely accurate. Rather than creaking step by step down the trail in a neat queue, the members of the journeying group angled outward in both directions, dotting the Kansas landscape in an uneven spatter. Hazel was able to crane her neck and spot the slowly moving canopies on either side of her at any given time, save for when the sky dimmed and the first stars made their appearance. But the onset of dusk signaled time to reconvene and circle the wagons to herd the oxen together for the night anyhow. She was constantly reminded of stories she had heard as a young girl about traveling gypsy clans, and Lillian's rabbit foot in her pocket only put her in mind of the whimsical tales even further. She had never been so exhausted in her life, yet she was never shy of energy. Her muscles often ached, her side frequently stitched, and her fair skin continuously developed and redeveloped a coat of sore red windburn, but she lingered awake night after night until the wee hours of morning before falling into a troubled slumber. The butterflies cluttering her stomach when she interacted with Elijah never ceased to flit about, and she eagerly awaited the end of the daily walks, not to relax, but to socialize with her new friends. Looking after all three children, even the unaffectionate Timothy, delighted her, particularly seeing Nellie blossom beneath the imaginative guide of Calvin. Somehow, in the midst of late autumn weather and virtual homelessness, and confused feelings for both her late husband and her new one, Hazel was happier than she had ever been. Nearly 2 weeks into their travels, still within Kansas borders, the train came to a stop for the night and gathered around in their traditional circle to keep the cattle wrangled. They had opted to stop early, before the sky had even begun to transform into its dusky blend of orange and pink, after happening across a large amount of abandoned goods. Hazel noticed within the first couple of days that items littered the trail, sometimes isolated and individual and other times in strewn piles. While the objects were ordinarily superficial in nature, such as trunks of Sunday clothing or barrels of weighty eatables, this particular instance met the lucky adventurers with discarded tools, extra ammo for various weapons, and even a few spare wagon parts. Emmanuel Stedman, one of the three brothers who occupied the wagon most often, traveling on the Crawfords' left, was elated to stumble upon an intact wheel to replace the one he had fractured slightly the day before. Jeb and Elijah joined the others in perusing the loot, while Hazel, Lillian, and many other women began preparing an early supper around their respective fires. As usual, Hazel and Lillian cooked together. Since meeting in Independence, the two families had gladly pooled the use of their goods. Tonight, they were eating from Hazel's stock. "I know I needn't worry," Lillian was saying good-naturedly as she stoked the flames to a respectable height. "Jeb is an excellent provider, as I'm sure you've noticed." "He is," Hazel agreed. She was mixing the ingredients for a simple molasses cake, an extra treat to enjoy and a favorite of Nellie's. The women were discussing their plans upon reaching Oregon, or rather, Lillian was explaining her intentions and Hazel was listening. "I just fear we will be so very out of sorts. We've always been mountain folk, you know," the flaxen-haired pixie explained. She sighed and stood from her crouch, wiping her hands on her apron. Then she turned toward Hazel and asked boldly, "What of you and your lovely daughter? Do you intend to remain with Elijah, or do you have family who will take you in?" Hazel froze, the spoon pausing in the center of the batter. A sweeping fear washed over her in icy waves, and she dared not meet Lillian's eyes. She had not told Lillian, or anyone else for that matter, of her plans for Oregon, and her friend's exacting insight was both eerie and alarming. "Why do you ask?" she inquired carefully, still refusing to meet the probing gaze resting upon her. Lillian hummed with understanding, finally forcing Hazel to look up. "Don't fear. I've a knack for knowing things I oughtn't, but the men haven't a clue," she said. No relief flowed through Hazel at the words, and Lillian went on. "I knew Helena before she died, and I know Elijah still grieves her. I also see the widowed look on your face. You still grieve for your lost love as well, don't you?" "Yes," Hazel murmured. There was a thrumming in her ears, though whether it was panicked blood rushing through her veins or a fresh bout of guilt she was not certain. "You and Elijah may be friendly, but you're distant," Lillian commented. "I expect you two married for the sake of your children and your futures. Once we've gotten to Oregon, you no longer need one another, unless you desire to stay together, of course." "You believe I wedded Elijah with the intention of leaving the marriage?" Hazel asked hoarsely. It may have been the truth, but it was bitter on her tongue. Lillian thought for a beat, then said, I believe you did what you believed was best for your child and yourself. I don't feel you've done anything wicked. Elijah is a good man who only wishes his boys to have a mother. He seeks no affection. His romance still lingers with Helena. Were he capable of falling in love again, I would perhaps opine differently, but you are a well-suited match for your conveniences. Should you dematerialize your marriage when the conveniences are no longer necessary, I would take no umbrage, though I haven't a stake in this." Hazel was speechless. Lillian's vast knowledge of the unspoken circumstances was startling, and Hazel felt a burst of envy for the woman's natural intuitions. "I intend to take up with my sister and her family," Hazel admitted finally. Shame painted her voice, and she was unable to stop herself from hanging her head slightly. "Elijah is unaware of my plans, and I've not yet mentioned my desire for an annulment." Lillian cocked her head, and a brow to match. "Why do you speak with such regret?" "As I've said, a termination of the union is unlikely to sour either one of you." Then, before Hazel could respond, Lillian's eyes grew so wide that they were nearly saucers, and her mouth popped open into a perfectly round O. "Oh, it is ever so clear to me now. You have grown fond of him." "I haven't," Hazel bit back stoutly. "Of course I enjoy his company well enough, and I feel secure in saying we have become friends. He is also rather nice to look at, but I am not so superficial as to regard his appearance into such a rank of importance." Though she said nothing, Lillian's knowing smile spoke 1,000 words, and Hazel felt a strange tug in her gut. She resumed stirring with extreme vigor before placing the bowl down a little too hard and slopping batter down the side of the dish. "Come," she hastened, "we ought to start the bacon." Throughout supper and into the evening, Hazel could not shake the feeling of Lillian's eyes bearing into her, particularly when she and Elijah interacted. Even as she put the children to bed in the tent, Lillian's weighty observance filled her with uncomfortable awareness. She still adored the sprightly woman dearly, but she was wary now. Her secret had been freed from its confines and allowed to soar free, and it flitted over Hazel's head like a looming storm cloud. She was grateful when Jeb and Lillian retired for the night. "The cake was delicious," Elijah said as Hazel tucked the dishes away into their assigned trunk. He spoke in a low tone, deep and pulsing, as most of the camp had long since ventured into their tents for a restful night's sleep. "Thank you," Hazel whispered back, offering him a small smile of gratitude. He rose to his feet to ensure the fire was little more than scarlet embers before strolling to her. Gently, he removed the last of the dishes from her hands and placed them into the trunk himself. Hazel stepped back and watched, wondering if he simply wanted to help or if he had other intentions, but she needed not wonder long. Elijah closed the trunk, straightened up, and turned to her. Even through the blackness of midnight, she could see the glimmer in his eyes. "I require only a moment of your time," he murmured. Then, without a further word of explanation, his palm fell flush against Hazel's cheek, and she felt sparks shooting between his skin and hers. He leaned forward, and just as she took in a sharp breath, his mouth found hers. She rolled her lips into his, and she allowed his taste to take her away. Chapter 10. The clouds overhead were thick and silvery, laden with turmoil and threatening to tip streams of heavy raindrops down upon the inching travelers below. The wind was idle, thankfully, but the air still pricked at any bit of unlucky exposed skin, with the promise of a nearing winter. Dying plains grass turned crisp and hairless, slapped at the knees of passers-by. The vast expanse of silence was severed by the creaking of wooden wheels and the crunching of determined footsteps. Despite the day's dreary gloom, Elijah was practically radiant. The chill in the air exhilarated him, and every time he recalled the kiss he had shared with Hazel the night before, penetrating warmth burst in his chest and spread throughout his body. The world looked different through glowing eyes. He had not intended the kiss to happen, nor had he intended the feelings that riveted him afterward. He had simply watched Hazel cleaning up and putting things away to easily transition into travel the next morning, and he had been overcome with unanticipated passion for her. For a month, 2 weeks from Fredericktown to Independence, and 2 weeks across Kansas, he watched her mother, his boys, with loving tenderness, persist forward through warm days and cool nights, and encourage others to continue on despite her own exhaustion. She smiled, and smiled often. He saw her flourish into a vibrant woman in the company of Lillian, and experienced the feistier, more playful sides of her personality in his own interactions with her. Hazel was strong, kind, and beautiful, and she had enchanted him unknowingly until he had been unable to hold back any longer. And to his utmost surprise, he felt no semblance of guilt or self-loathing after they parted, either. He thought he might have remembered Helena at once, and felt the sting of his loss. But Helena had somehow become less of a knife through his ever-yearning heart, and more of a bittersweet sentiment. He still loved her, of course. He would always love her, his first wife and mother of his children, but somehow, in the days traversing the untamed wild of America, he had started to move on, and Hazel had begun to permeate his fancies. They had not spoken about the kiss, nor about anything so intimate, yet tension was absent between them. Elijah felt whole, renewed, and the serenity he saw on Hazel's lovely face indicated she felt the same. Perhaps there was no need to discuss it, or perhaps they were both satisfied to wait until the appropriate moment. Whatever the case, they walked steadily side by side, and he felt at ease in his wife's presence. "Ma?" Nellie's voice pierced through his thoughts and snagged him back to the present. She was a darling girl, and while he had always been quite happy to be a father to 2 boys, the angelic-faced dear made it easy for him to discover how much he enjoyed having a daughter as well. Though she had not called him father yet, or pa, as Timothy and Calvin were wont to do, she often sought him out to show him a special flower she had picked, or a new trick she had learned from one of the girls in the other wagons. Her big eyes lit each time he praised her, and on more than one occasion she fell asleep against his leg while sitting around the fire at night. She had taken to him, and he to her, and his affection for her seemed only greater in the light of his newly understood feelings toward the child's mother. At this moment, however, Nellie sounded not like the cheerful, imaginative fairy girl he had become accustomed to. Her voice was shrill and pitched to gravel, and it tore through him like an arrow. He stopped cold in his tracks and spun on his heels, Hazel whipping about as well to see the small figure racing toward them at such a speed that she nearly stumbled and fell to her knees several times. Her hair streamed out behind her in wind-mussed tangles, and her dress was muddied to her shins. She looked a mess, a frightful mess, and panic sprang into the heart of Elijah's throat. "What's wrong? What has happened?" Hazel demanded at once. She was moving before the first word fell from her lips, soaring across the prairie to meet the child, and Elijah was hot on her heels. "Are you hurt? Are you ill?" "Calvin, he's bit it." Nellie was barely understandable through her harsh, labored breaths, but Elijah's ears perked upon hearing his youngest son's name, and again, panic throbbed in his chest. "What has happened?" Hazel cried again. Elijah was running so hard now he could hardly hear a thing over his own thudding footsteps. But Nellie bent at the waist with her hands pressed to her knees to catch a few breaths, and said not another word until he reached her. He dropped to her eye level and asked fearfully, "Nellie, what happened to Calvin?" The worst was running through his mind. Perhaps the boy had been playing too close to a wagon and been run over by one of the wheels, or a group of rogue outlaws snatched him up for ransom. His gaze pressed into Nellie's face, and the tracks of tears on her dust-smeared skin offered him no promising reassurance. "He's got bitted," she exclaimed again. Fresh sobs bubbled from her chest, and new tears rolled down her cheeks. There was no humor in her expression at all. This was not a misguided childhood prank, for the girl was clearly terrified. "Bit it?" Elijah repeated in confusion. Understanding dawned on him. Bit? He was bit. What bit him? Hazel had reached their sides as well and was gathering the weeping child into her arms, and he heard Nellie's voice through the gap in Hazel's elbow. "A snake." Over Nellie's head, Hazel's eyes met Elijah's, and his panic numbed just enough for reason to squirrel inside. "It's too cold and too late in the year for snakes, darling," Hazel told her daughter, vocalizing the very thought in Elijah's mind. "Are you quite certain he didn't happen into a pricker bush?" "No," burbled Nellie with an adamant shake of her tiny head. "I saw it. It was brown and ugly, and it tried to snap him in two." Elijah straightened up again. His heart was still pounding, his adrenaline still coursing, but so focused was he on Calvin's rescue that his emotions had drained completely and left only logic in their place. He extracted Nellie from Hazel's hold and hoisted the girl up into his arms. "I need you to show me where." He began running, the small body grasped firmly to his masculine one to prevent injury, and Nellie swung her arm out with a pointed finger to guide him. He heard the swish of Hazel's skirts and the crunch of her shoes behind him, and he knew she was following, but he did not slow down to keep pace. If what Nellie said was true, Calvin was potentially in danger. Only a few seconds of running revealed the boy to him. He saw a mop of hair poking up over the weedy grass, moving in place as if the child was standing but not walking. "Calvin!" he shouted, his voice ringing out over the now distant sounds of wagon wheels and grumpy oxen. Reaching his son, Elijah placed Nellie carefully to the ground. Hazel panted as she gathered Nellie against her, and Elijah turned his attention to Calvin. The boy was not crying, nor was he screaming in pain, but the evidence of the alleged snake attack was the most vivid thing at the scene. Calvin's leg, right at the place where the calf met the knee bend, was exposed through torn trouser, and rivulets of semi-transparent scarlet dribbled from 2 punctures. Calvin looked up and, in a small voice, murmured, "I'm sorry, Pa." "Sorry? Whatever for?" Elijah asked. He was very worried, but he attempted to keep his voice level for the sake of soothing his son. "You didn't ask to be bitten." "I went too far," Calvin lamented. "Ma said to stay where she could see me, and I went too far." Elijah glanced up at Hazel. She met his gaze, and he saw concern mirrored back at him. With a grunt, he slid an arm beneath Calvin's back and an arm beneath his uninjured knee, letting the wounded leg hang freely in the air. "Come on, son. Let's get you back to camp and have a look." They trudged back toward the wagon, where Timothy was walking backward alongside the oxen in an effort to watch what was happening. Ordinarily, Elijah would have scolded him for doing something as careless as walking backward so near the cattle, for he might end up tripping and tumbling beneath one of the wagon wheels, but he considered Calvin's condition more imperative. He did, however, call out to his eldest son, "Stop the oxen, I need to get Calvin in the wagon." Timothy's stare moved to his brother, who was dangling almost motionlessly from his father's arms, and he obeyed the command at once. As the oxen were brought to a halt, Elijah barked another order. "Go get Jeb. Tell him we need his help." The 8-year-old did not need to be asked twice. His shoes kicked up dust as he leaped into a sprint immediately. Elijah did not watch him go, instead concentrating on laying Calvin comfortably into the wagon bed. Hazel watched with bated breath. When he had finished, she wrapped her fingers into his shirt sleeve and pulled him back a step. "Do you know anything about snake bites?" she asked softly. Elijah shook his head. "Very little. I know more about snakes than about treating their bites." He swung his eyes toward Calvin for a moment to ensure the boy could not hear what he said next. "The punctures are too large for an ordinary grass snake. It's likely to be a big breed anyhow, as it's too cold for a small one to last long. My guess is a bull snake, maybe a young adult. They tend to burrow after gophers, and Calvin may have stepped where one was burrowing." "They aren't venomous?" Hazel anxiously questioned. "No, but he's still at risk for infection, and we have a long way to travel yet before we reach Fort Laramie, let alone Oregon." Elijah's stomach was tumbling, but not with the excited tumbles he felt when he thought of Hazel. He was frightened. Feeling rather sick, he looked at his apple-cheeked bride and whispered vulnerably, "I'm going to need you." The tensed, nervous muscles in her jaw softened, and she reached her hand forward to take his. "I'm here," she whispered back. Chapter 11. The end of November and entrance into December brought with it a gale of trouble. Calvin had been on the mend from his snake bite for the better part of the month thanks to the wildlife knowledge and medicinal skills of Jeb Monk. But the boy awoke one morning with his legs swollen and oozing a putrid yellow substance. The infection malady stumped Jeb and alarmed Elijah, and only after Lillian's careful analysis did they discover Calvin had been scratching the healing wound and had inadvertently reopened it to infection. As if the now present fear that the child would either lose his leg or perish was not enough to manage, rations were running low, and grassy vegetation for the cattle to feed on was sparse at the onset of winter. People were tired and hungry, and though they had passed through Fort Kearny shortly after entering Nebraska territory and managed to secure themselves a few additional supplies, the seedlings of hopelessness were beginning to sprout throughout the travelers. Hazel was no exception. She was chronically stiff with overexertion, and she had begun resigning herself to small portions and a rumbling belly to ensure the children had plenty to eat. Like everyone else, she had an inkling of doubt lingering in her mind that they might never reach their planned destination, which made the days of walking seem exponentially longer and the nights of rest disproportionately shorter. The moment of romance she had shared with Elijah had stimulated frequent and meaningful looks between them, but it had not blossomed further under the dampening of Calvin's status. She was very worried about Calvin, indeed, so much that she often felt she would tremble with the anxiety of it all. She had come to love the child. His sunny grins and creative games fell to the wayside as he ailed in the back of the wagon, his little body jolting each time the oxen stumped over a bump or a divot. Timothy had taken to sitting in the wagon with him to hold him steady as they traveled. So attentive was the elder brother that he even insisted on feeding the child. Nellie, too, had become forlorn and reverted back to her reserved self. Hazel grew accustomed to feeling Nellie's hand in hers as they plodded along, and nearly forgot the sounds of her daughter frolicking around. Elijah, however, was most afflicted with the symptoms of paralyzing concern. His mouth seemed permanently affixed in a straight, thin line of miserable musing, and he never strayed further than a few steps from the wagon as they journeyed forth. It ached Hazel's heart to see him in such a way, and she wished there was something she could do to ease his fretting, but she knew better than to make fruitless attempts. If it were Nellie in the back of that wagon rather than Calvin, she would have been utterly inconsolable, and Elijah would have had no hope of reviving her from her woes. The difficulties of traveling across the country and her stepson's bite were amplified further on a very cold, very rainy Wednesday. It was the 5th day of December, and while they had not yet been met with snow, the weather had become very grim and unpleasant. When a bellowing call reverberated back to her ears from the frontmost wagons in the train, Hazel assumed they were sending a warning to the others in the party of an approaching storm. "I didn't hear what was said," she remarked to Elijah, who had looked up and cocked his head upon hearing the noise. "Neither did I," he responded tightly. He had not been cold to her in his worrying for Calvin, but he had lost some of his brooding charm and saucy spark. Hazel imagined his fear of losing his son after having already lost the boy's mother was overtaking his usual self, and she did not take his behavior as a personal insult. Nevertheless, she wished he would speak to her without sounding so pained. "Perhaps we ought to venture ahead and ask," she suggested. Elijah's mouth tightened further until his lips were naught but paper-thin slits. Ordinarily, he would have volunteered to jog forward and convene with those leading the train, but this time he was silent. His eyes flitted toward Calvin's dozing form reluctantly. "I will go," Hazel declared at once, her heart again going out to him for his plight. He looked at her, and she saw mixed emotions on his face. When he told her he would need her, it had been a moment of raw honesty, a look past his ingrained masculine dominance into the terrified father beneath. She meant it when she told him she was here with him, and would be here with him, and this was one of the moments she could demonstrate her dedication to helping him through this time. Without waiting for him to argue with her, if only to ease his own misgivings about sending his wife for the news rather than going himself. She pressed her hand to his forearm in silent reassurance and plucked her skirts up around her ankles. The wagons at the head of the train were a respectable distance ahead of the Crawfords, and it took Hazel several minutes of running to reach them. She was forced to weave and wind in order to avoid startling anyone's oxen, and by the time she surpassed the flanking wagons to reach Mervyn Hickenbeck, a stabbing ache had developed in her chest. "I'm afraid we couldn't hear your call," she wheezed, pressing her fist to her bosom and attempting to breathe properly. "There are sure to be others behind us without word as well. Is there a storm approaching?" Mervyn was a sturdy man with broad shoulders and a drawling accent, and he had an air about him reminiscent of a strict schoolteacher that left Hazel feeling sheepish in his presence. "No," he said bluntly. He jerked his head forward. "We've come to the river." Hazel followed the direction of his nod, and her eyes widened. The bank of a brown lauded river was growing nearer and nearer with each step. The other side was perfectly visible, but the stretch of water was not a small one, nor a calm one. Without her heavy panting, she was able to hear the rushing hum of a powerful flow, and she gasped, not for lack of breath, but for fright. "Best let the others know if you'd not mind," Mervyn told her. He appeared unafraid of traversing the river, but his wife beside him, a full-figured woman with a friendly face, was knotting her fingers together with fearful anticipation. "Yes," Hazel breathed, hoping she looked braver than she felt. "Yes, I shall tell them." She trotted rather than ran back, so she could repeat the message to the wagons she passed on the way. When she returned to Elijah, he was as stony-faced as when she had left him. She reiterated the news, and Elijah darkened. "This will not be good for Calvin," he said. "No," Hazel agreed. She looked over her shoulder to see the few canopies bumping along behind them and tried to hide her disquiet. However, when she turned back to Elijah, he was deliberately watching her, and she knew he was not ignorant of her thoughts. He reached a hand out and took hers. Raising it to his lips, he kissed each of her knuckles and murmured, "We will make it. We will be just fine." Hazel felt the familiar leap in her belly at his touch, but it was not the time to muse about such things. "I ought to tell the others. I'm certain they don't know what is happening yet," she said. Elijah kissed the back of her hand before releasing it back to her. "No," he contradicted with a shake of his head. "I shall tell them." "But what about Calvin?" Hazel asked in surprise. He lifted his hand again and pressed the pad of his thumb to her chin, parting her lips slightly. "Calvin will be no worse in my absence," he told her. "He is with you. There is no one I would trust more to care for him." Hazel swallowed, drinking in Elijah's words of kindness and faith, and he skimmed his thumb upward to brush over her lower lip. Then he departed and left her with only a tingle where his thumb had just been. Chapter 12. "Do you think we should seal the schooners?" Jeb was running his hand along the side of his wagon as Elijah explained to him the news of the nearing river. He had not appeared alarmed as Elijah had expected. On the contrary, the eccentric man was calm and matter-of-fact, as if Elijah had merely told him the temperature. "I don't know if we are to attempt to cross the river, or if we should prepare the wagons," Elijah admitted. Jeb's nonchalant attitude did nothing to soothe his own set of worries. "I'm hoping there will be ferries, as there were when departing Independence. By my guess, we've met the Platte River," Jeb theorized thoughtfully, stroking his chin. "And if that be the case, we haven't a hope for a ferry. The Platte's too shallow. Now we'll likely be fording through the California crossing." How Jeb knew this, Elijah could not be certain, but he trusted his friend enough to believe him, and felt a swoop of apprehension. Fording a river was a risky business. Many, many stories of prairie emigrants falling prey to a sudden shift in water flow, or oxen making a single misstep and pulling everything from the wagon to the travelers with them into the current, had made their way to Fredericktown. But thus far they had been mere flickers in the back of his mind. Now it terrified him. Calvin was unable to walk, and if the wagon was swept away, he would be taken with it. The train came to a halt as a group before the riverbank. Wagons gathered more closely together than they had been since their first meeting in Independence. A quick glance around told Elijah he was not the only one with concerns, and several men even decided to venture along the river's side in either direction in hopes of finding a secure route across. They returned a short while later with no good news, and Elijah eyed the ford with mounting trepidation. "Are we to walk across?" Hazel whispered to him, her gray eyes stormy. "You will ride in the wagon with the children," Elijah told her. "I will guide the oxen across." "Surely you cannot believe that to be wise," she exclaimed in horror. "You could be washed away." He nodded. Being washed away was a very real possibility, but his options were limited, and his greatest priority was seeing to it that she and the children made it to the other side safely. Besides, it was nearly impossible, a feat to expect the oxen to maneuver themselves properly and avoid slippery places, or worse, sand traps lingering beneath the water. "There is no other way about it," he said gravely. Mervyn Hickenbeck was the first to venture into the water. His shoes splashed through the surface, and he dropped, in height by nearly a foot, in only a matter of steps. One hand was fitted securely into an ox's harness to direct the animals, forcing him to walk backward as they cautiously towed down the bank into the river. His wife, child, and teenage niece sat in the wagon bed with still faces of steely determination, but Elijah was certain he could see Mrs. Hickenbeck trembling against a barrel. One step, two steps, they eased forward, Mervyn backward, until the oxen were bathing up to their flanks, and Mervyn had no choice but to turn himself around and tug the cattle with him. His hair was dampening, either with sweat or splashing water, and his shoulders were still visible above the meniscus, but the rest of his body, from the underarms down, was swallowed by the murky pool. Several observing men called out to him, asking if he needed assistance, but Mervyn did not answer in his unbreakable concentration. Finally, his sopping form began to emerge, followed by the oxen and then the wagon. The passengers jostled a bit as the wheels connected with the uneven opposite bank, but they remained seated and stabilized on dry land. The Hickenbeck clan was met with a clamor of applause, cheers, whoops, and whistles of celebration from the members of the train, and Mervyn motioned with a dripping hand. "Come," he shouted, "one at a time, and stick to the ford." The second family ventured into the river, then a third and a fourth. Elijah watched each cross with precise analysis, attempting to determine the riskiest places and the faults of the guides. When it was Jeb's turn to cross, Elijah's fingers went numb at the tips. 8 others had made it safely to the other side thus far, but every time seemed to become more and more difficult for both the oxen and the people. The Stedman brothers were all in the water to help their cattle, but twice Elijah had been sure they were going to fall beneath the surface and drown. Jeb was the last to cross before it would be the Crawfords' turn, and it was Elijah's final chance to ensure success. There were no moments of alarm for the first half of Jeb's trek. Lillian and Patty were in the wagon bed, as the other women and children had been, though Lillian was more of a participant and used the loose reins to assist Jeb with the oxen. It was not until Jeb's chest rose up from the deepest portion of the water that near disaster struck. He slipped, and his head disappeared with a tumultuous splash. Lillian shrieked outright, and Patty hollered, and those on the opposite side raced forward to rescue the missing Jeb. His oxen surprisingly remained calm and continued plodding forward. But Elijah was struck with the horrifying idea that Jeb had been pulled under by the current, and now the oxen's hooves and the wagon's wheels were crushing him, holding him beneath the water and breaking every bone in his body. Just as Elijah moved to jump into the river himself, Jeb popped back into view. He was sputtering and coughing violently, but he pursued forward with the aid of the other men until he and his lot were out of harm's way. "Get into the wagon," Elijah said tersely to Hazel. He did not intend to sound so demanding and rigid, but he was steeling himself for the dangerous task. "Elijah," Hazel protested, "Jeb very nearly drowned. We must find another way." "Into the wagon, Hazel," he repeated, turning his eyes to her and glowering unyieldingly. She hesitated, but she finally relented and clambered into the wagon. As she sat, She tucked Nellie beneath one arm and Calvin beneath another. Timothy sat on Calvin's other side and held his little brother's arm as tightly as possible without hurting the young lad. Elijah watched Hazel look to Timothy, who darted an uncertain glance back at her, and he saw her pat the brave boy's shoulder consolingly before taking hold of Calvin once more. Her gaze met Elijah's, and she offered him a small nod. They were ready. With clammy palms, Elijah curled his fingers around Figgy's harness. The first step into the water sent a shock through him. It was extraordinarily cold, much colder than even the air. The second step was as jarring as the first, but by the time he was waist-deep, his lower half had numbed. He yanked on the harness to encourage Frank and Figgy into the chilled depths, and they reluctantly followed his lead. The wagon wheels split the muddy water into two as it quaked down the bank, and an almighty splash burst into Elijah's face. He blinked rapidly, momentarily blinded, but continued on as though nothing had occurred. With water in his eyes, it was difficult to make out Hazel's face, but he could see her and all three children watching him as he urged the oxen on and on, while he stepped unseeingly backward. The loss of feeling in his legs had seemed a blessing at first, a protectant against the frigid waters, but he was beginning to wish his nerves were not dulled into nothingness, for he was unable to properly feel the river floor beneath his feet, and could only guess at the stability of the ground upon which he stood. At the halfway mark, when the river was at its deepest, Elijah prepared to turn around as Mervyn and every other man had before him. As he did, however, Frank took a step forward. Suddenly, as swiftly as a breath, Frank's shoulder plunged beneath the water's surface, and the ox's head was instantly submerged. He broke through with a wail of panic, but his flailing movements caused such an upheaval that Figgy was nearly taken down in Frank's next dip, and the wagon rocked vigorously from side to side. "No!" Elijah roared. He leapt forward, the water attempting to resist him, and pulled with all his might on the harness, hoping to lift Frank back onto a stable river floor. The ox was much too heavy, though, and Elijah was thrown under water in the fray. Screams permeated the air from either bank, and, above them, Elijah was sure he heard the shrieks of Hazel and the children. He scrambled for footing, but Frank was in a state of ceaseless frenzy now, and continuously threw Elijah back below in his hysterical attempts to reach the shoreline. Elijah gasped desperately for air as his nostrils and mouth and lungs filled with filthy water. Strange white bubbles were rising behind his eyelids, and all discernible sounds were saturating into a single hum. In an instant, he wondered if this was what it felt like to die. Then, as quickly as it had all started, his toe caught on something hard and fingers wrapped around his arms. Through the blur of water-blinded eyes, he made out the tenacious visage of Jeb, accompanied by the wavy outlines of others. The hum that had overtaken his ears dissolved into individual sounds again, and he tasted something earthen on his tongue. He was on land. Dry, dry land. Throaty coughs rolled from his diaphragm and pushed stream after stream of murky water from his insides. A new set of hands found him, these hands softer and smoother than those that had pulled him from his possible grave. They wrapped around his forehead and tugged upward, lifting his face from the ground and revealing a panorama of legs before him. He rolled over, effectively extricating himself from the hand's grasp, and saw Hazel above him. "Elijah!" she cried, every note in her voice stricken with panicked horror. "The children," he croaked. He sounded as though he had swallowed a bucket of sand rather than gallons of water, coarse and gritty. "Did the children make it all right?" Yes, the children are quite well," she answered hastily. "Elijah, can you breathe?" "And you," he persisted. "Did you make it all right?" The corners of her eyes softened, and the lilts of panic eased fractionally as she said softly, "Yes, I am very well." He did not wait for her to bombard him with further questions, nor did he care that he was before the eyes of the entire wagon train. He reached up, took Hazel's neck in his palm, and pulled her down to kiss her as deeply as he had the night in Kansas. Chapter 13. Fort Laramie was like a sanctuary in the most desolate of places. The towering walls surrounding the fort should have felt restrictive and suffocating after spending so long in wide open space, but Elijah found them a source of comfort and promised security. The snowflakes drifting in thick swirls from the night sky were not a threat to health and well-being from inside the enclosure. In fact, Elijah reveled in the beauty of the sparkling shapes that alit on his lashes as he secured the flaps of the wagon's cotton cover. Finally, a sense of ease had wormed its way through his worry-hardened outlook. The train had arrived at Fort Laramie only hours before, and Elijah had been startled to discover from one of the men who greeted them that it was Christmas Eve. He, along with the majority of the traveling party, had been keeping track of the days as they passed, or so he had thought, but somewhere along the way the mornings and evenings must have blended together and brought the day of Christ upon them in secret. The children were elated to discover this news, of course. Nellie and Calvin took it upon themselves to serenade the fort and the other emigrants with crowing hymnals, and even Timothy hummed along when he forgot his stoicism. Elijah was tired and hungry and still very concerned about Calvin's leg, and the incident at the river riled him with morbid nightmares almost every time he slept, but a sense of peace settled over him in knowing tomorrow was a blessed day, and they would be spending it in a place of safety and contentment. "We have a room to board in tonight and tomorrow," Hazel told him. Her shoes crunched on the crisp snow as she rounded the wagon to address him. "It's only one room, but it's certainly a relief for a short time. Lillian and Patty and Jeb are to stay there as well, in a space of their own, of course." "Wonderful," Elijah said, pleased. He secured the last flap in place, then turned and pulled his wife to him. Her slender form curved against his angular one fittingly, and he wondered not for the first time how he managed to be wed to her for so long without indulging in the simple joy of feeling her against him. She looked up at him through her long lashes. "I know we have little to spare right now," she began tentatively, "but I wish to get the children something for Christmas. Nothing big, of course, just a simple something from the store. A fresh piece of fruit, perhaps. I'm sure I can go without purchasing a replenishment of molasses for cake." Elijah smiled. He was already unwaveringly enthralled with the chestnut-held beauty, but her display of selfless generosity was like a charm cast upon him, rendering him starry-eyed and light-hearted. Though he made a conscious effort to avoid comparing Hazel to Helena, he was familiar with the feeling Hazel aroused within him. It was the same feeling he had while courting his first wife, the crackling thrill of boyhood romance. Hazel was not a replacement or a substitute for what he once had. She was fresh and new and original, and he was captivated beyond recognition. He kissed her, a gentle yet affectionate kiss on her delicate lips, then pulled back and nodded. "We can manage both a small gift and your molasses, I expect," he assured her. Her expression was doubtful, but after a second kiss, the doubt had vanished. In its place was serene satisfaction. Hazel unwove his arms from her waist and stepped back. "It is well past the children's bedtime, and we best get as much sleep in a proper bed as we are able to," she suggested. "Perhaps we should, but I'd rather stay up for a bit if you don't mind," was his response. "Would you join me?" Hazel studied him momentarily. "If you wish," she eventually conceded, the corners of her lovely mouth twitching with a hidden smile. She then departed to see the children to bed, and Elijah followed behind after ensuring Frank and Figgy were comfortable for the night in the fort's stable. When Hazel returned, Elijah offered her his arm, which she took. "I've asked Lillian to look in while we're out," she said. "Good." Elijah began walking, and Hazel fell into stride with him. They strolled slowly and quietly with only the sounds of their shoes on snow as conversation. The silence between them was not uncomfortable in the slightest, but Elijah broke it anyhow to make a request. "Tell me about William." Hazel looked at him in surprise, and for a moment Elijah thought she would not oblige him. "Why do you wish to know about William?" she asked. "He was and is important to you. I'd very much like to know of him." She turned her face downward to survey her own footfalls, and again she appeared reluctant. Elijah did not press her. He understood the difficulties of recalling the best parts of a lost love. When she finally did speak, her voice was softer, lower. "William was kind, very kind. He was often wont to give our extra pennies to the homeless men he happened across. Once he even asked one into our home during a particularly hateful snowstorm." She smiled sadly. "He was only a bookkeeper, you know. We hadn't much to spare, but he made certain we never went without." "Were you married young?" Elijah inquired curiously. Her hand felt nice in the curve of his elbow, and again he was reminded of his days courting as a young man. "Not so very young," she replied. "I was 18 and he was 23. We met at church, actually. My mother was forever changing churches. Her opinions of the pastors were based solely on the power of their sermons. If they delivered a single sermon from which her attention waned, we were in a different church the following. It's one of the perks of city living, I suppose, a ripe selection of churches. Anyhow, it was our first time in this particular church, and it happened to be where William and his family attended. We began courting the next day." Elijah raised his brows. "You fancied him so quickly?" Hazel laughed and shook her head, saying adamantly, "Oh no, I thought him too thin and his nose too beaked. It was my mother who encouraged me to go with him. She said his nose was aristocratic and that he was certain to come from money. She was quite right. His family was respectably wealthy, but William refused to take anything from them to live in luxury. He was unshakably determined that all his worldly possessions and experiences would be earned with his own hand. I admired him for that, and I grew much fonder of him for it." And again Elijah was struck with the moral fortitude of the doe-eyed woman. She was so good, so strong, and yet wholly unapologetic of herself. Her gaze alone had a way of humbling Elijah into realizing there were many missed opportunities throughout his life in which he could have been more giving, more positive, or even more assertive. She elicited a sense of introspection from him he never knew was possible, and she encouraged him to grow, to blossom into a better man, by simply being. If he did not know her and only heard of her mysterious ways, he would have assumed her a witch. "What of Helena?" Hazel asked, tugging Elijah back into the present. "I do hope you will tell me a bit about her." The very same reluctance that had shown on Hazel's face now coursed through Elijah. He admittedly had mourned Helena less and less as time had passed with Hazel, but it came reeling back as he relived the memories. Nevertheless, Hazel had opened herself to him, and he owed her the same. "Helena and I knew one another from children. She, too, was born in Fredericktown, just a year younger than me. I was good friends with her brother, actually." He reminisced momentarily of his antics with Donald, a boy with a very wide mouth and a very daring spirit. "I began courting her when she turned 15, which her mother disapproved of greatly, but her father encouraged. He approved of me. I often helped him during harvest. I was a farm boy, as I've told you." Hazel nodded. "We were married when I was 17, just after her 16th birthday. If I am to be honest, I was infinitely more in love with her than she was with me, at least at that time. I don't think she planned to ever marry, as it was her desire to teach school, but she came around after a bit. Helena was very stubborn and didn't bend easily. Many men would have found such a trait bothersome and disobedient, but I liked it a good deal. It gave her personality. I've never been fond of the subservient sort, and Helena had her own way of doing things." He chuckled and pressed his hand around Hazel's. "Not unlike you, I'm afraid." She smiled. There was no jealousy in her eyes as she watched him speak, nor did she stiffen with offense. As usual, she was a model listener, and Elijah's hesitancy to speak of Helena dissipated. When she became ill, she wanted to continue working around the house. Helena wasn't one who enjoyed sitting still. I refused to permit this, of course, for fear of exposing the boys to her illness, but she kept on demanding to be let from her bed. She said she was sure I forgot to sweep behind the icebox. He chuckled again, but this one was rather sorrowful. An image of Helena's frail form tucked beneath the quilt flooded his brain, and he heard her good-natured nagging in his mind. She died of pneumonia not long after. It hurt him to think of Helena's last days, but to Elijah's surprise it was not a debilitating ache. Something about speaking of it, of vocalizing the memories he had kept locked up tightly, set his grief free. It was as if an emotional scab had fallen off, and now needed only to finish healing. Elijah stopped walking and turned to face Hazel directly. She gazed up at him with empathy, and he relished the freedom she offered for him to mourn as he needed. His heart filled to the brim not with grief, but with gratitude. At that moment, he understood the feelings he had been developing for Hazel. He was falling in love. Chapter 14. After 2 blissful nights slumbering in a comfortable bed and eating sumptuous meals, Hazel was renewed. Her spirit was lifted to new heights as well. To tell Elijah about William had lifted the shouldered weight of guilt she had been carrying. It had released the distress of her late husband's fading memory, and yet it had brought William closer. She felt him now, not hovering about her as a ghost of agonizing heartache, but as a gentle hand of reassurance. He was not gone from her life, nor from her heart, but she was no longer haunted by what she had lost. The train set off again. Snow had not stopped swirling down upon them during their entire stay in Fort Laramie, but it was a quiet snowfall with flakes that floated rather than pelted onto Hazel's chill rosy cheeks. Still, by the time they had traveled a week, her joints were constantly stiff with the frigidity of the wintry air, and she wondered if she would ever feel her face again. Even the thick-knitted scarf Lillian gave her did little to ensnare whatever body heat Hazel was able to produce, though she relied on it so much that she slept with the scarf wrapped around her chin every night. Nellie was not playing as they walked anymore. The little girl was a dainty thing, slender and small for her age, and the tundra temperatures brought in with the new year wreaked havoc on her tiny body. She now rode in the bed of the wagon with Calvin, the pair curled beneath several layers of blankets and often sleeping for several hours at a time with only brief periods of awareness between. Hazel encouraged the children, Calvin included, to move as frequently as possible to keep their blood flowing, but their motivation to do so was minimal. They had been able to secure some better treatment for Calvin's leg in the fort, as well as advice from a doctor, but the outlook for his wounded limb appeared grim. The doctor had urged them to remain behind at Fort Laramie rather than continuing onward to Oregon, prescribing an amputation at the top of the knee and many months of recuperation, and suggested they wait until summer to join up with the next train that ventured through. Elijah had rejected the suggestion at once. He insisted his son was too young to be confined to a life with only one leg, that the disability would make life in rugged Oregon essentially unbearable. "We have made do thus far," he had told Hazel firmly. "The pus has gone, and the redness lessened. It would be foolish to take such drastic action now." Hazel had been more uncertain, but Calvin was Elijah's child, and she deferred to his opinion. So they set off with the rest of the party, and 10 days later, Calvin's leg appeared no worse for the wear. The stay in Fort Laramie made an unexpected impact on Timothy as well. For months, the boy had barely met Hazel's eye, let alone spoke to her willingly. Since departing, however, he had cheered considerably. He still addressed Hazel by name and was not one for extended conversation, but he no longer shied when Hazel looked at him, and actually said more than "yes, ma'am," or "no, ma'am," when she asked him a question. So stunned was she the first time he offered her an entire sentence that she fell speechless and gawked at Elijah with incomprehension. Elijah's face had lit up, and he had a distinct bounce in his step for the rest of the day's travels. The prairie climate may have been taking a turn for the worse, but the Crawford family climate had certainly soared. It was the 10th day after leaving Fort Laramie that presented the travelers with their next great challenge. Mountains had been rising from the horizon in intervals when the snowfall slowed just enough to present them a view, and they had finally come upon the towering masses. Hazel heard a commotion at the frontmost wagons, but the pulsing whiteness around them and the general distance between them prevented her from observing the source. "There must be a problem," she mused quietly to Elijah. He shook his head. "This is South Pass. We should be able to continue, unless perhaps a snowdrift has blocked the way." They received an answer to their wonderings in a matter of seconds. Jeb bustled over to them with excitement scrawled across his leathery face. Hazel knew not how he had any more information than they, but she had learned over time that Jeb was rife with knowledge, and she trusted him. "We're at the South Pass," he said, clasping his hands together. "We're to coordinate with the Shoshone." Hazel's heart dropped. "Indians?" she asked in horror. Of the stories she had heard about westward emigrants, those of Indians tended to be full of gore and combat. She never found out if they were exaggerated for effect, of course, but as she had no measuring stick to judge them against, she had opted to believe them. The very idea of meeting Indians terrified her. Jeb nodded enthusiastically. "They guide the trains through the pass. I've heard they have some excellent items for trade, too." He clasped his hands together again, as if applauding his glee. Elijah frowned and said, "You think they are trustworthy?" "They know the mountains better than any of us," Jeb pointed out. He tilted his head in mild amusement. "You'd rather trust a native than go on blind, wouldn't you?" Hazel and Elijah's eyes met, and she saw her very same reservations reflected back at her. Jeb bounced off back to his own wagon, and they were left to wait until they received instructions on how to proceed. She was beginning to wish the wagons at the head of the train would just press onward without the assistance of the Shoshone, so she could start moving again and hopefully kindle some warmth in her numb toes, when a very tall, very brown figure emerged from a swirl of wet snowflakes. Hazel gasped, catching Elijah's attention, and she gestured wildly at the man. As Elijah turned to follow her motion, the long-legged individual came into better view. His hair was nearly as long as Hazel's when she left it unpinned, hanging to his waist in an ice-clumped raven-black sheet. He had very dark eyes, which were angled sharply on their inner sides, and his lips were thin but pronounced. She noticed the bridge of his nose between his eyes was rather flat, yet the shaft and tip were sleek and pointed. Though he had the features of a normal human face, there was something different about him that she could not quite pinpoint. Perhaps it was the sloped forehead or very rounded, very prominent cheekbones. Perhaps it was the short jaw that hinted at an underbite. Whatever the case, Hazel found him fearsome, and he was approaching quickly. Jeb's voice rose through the din of wind and oxen and conversations, and a quick glance in her peripheral vision revealed to Hazel a second Indian at the monk wagon. Lillian was smiling broadly, an expression Hazel guessed alarmed the Shoshone, for he was leering back at her uncertainly, and Jeb was spreading several goods out across the rearmost portion of his wagon bed to offer up for trade. Hazel wondered how many other Indians were wandering through the wagons without her knowing. The Indian who focused on the Crawfords had several items in his hands, including a rustic-looking hatchet and a stack of blankets that looked so warm Hazel almost forgot her fear. Elijah was tense, one hand gripping the lip of the wagon so tightly that his knuckles were white, and Hazel was certain he would have stepped forward if not for his concern about leaving Calvin unattended. "We have nothing to trade," Elijah said loudly and slowly. Though the Shoshone clearly was unable to understand a single word, he stopped. He studied Elijah for a moment, then raised the hatchet. Hazel clapped her hands over her mouth and Elijah froze, but the Indian merely twitched the weapon in offering. "We have nothing to trade," Elijah repeated. It was true, Hazel had no idea of what the Shoshone tribe could possibly want that they had anyhow, but the provisions they had acquired in Fort Laramie were only what they absolutely needed to finish their journey to Oregon. The Indian's eyes turned to Hazel, and her breath caught in her throat. He raised the blankets just as he had the hatchet. When she failed to respond, he swiveled his attention back to Elijah and brandished both items. Then he began approaching the wagon once more. Elijah stiffened visibly, and Hazel had to stop herself, from racing to the other side and tugging Nellie out of the bed. When he was within reach, however, the tall male merely placed the hatchet and the blankets amongst the barrels of food with a grunt. He began to turn around, but he stopped as he caught a glimpse of Calvin. Now Hazel did round the wagon. She stared at the Indian with as much defiant courage as she could muster, but he did not flinch. His eyes were pinned to Calvin's leg, which was wrapped in cloth and clearly swollen. "Thank you," Elijah said loudly, and Hazel knew he was attempting to divert the Indian's attention. "We appreciate your generosity." The Indian was not deterred. He reached into a satchel wrapped around his waist and extracted a smaller satchel of sorts. The cloth was beige and stringy in texture, and it was about the size of Hazel's palm, but the man handled it with delicacy. He held it between his thumb and forefinger and extended it to Elijah with a series of strange sounds, words in another language. Elijah took it, his brows knitted, and the Indian glanced between Calvin's leg and the satchel again to indicate its purpose. Elijah nodded, understanding dawning on his face. "Thank you," he said again. With a sharp nod, the Indian spun on his heel and disappeared back into the white mist of snow. Hazel walked to Elijah's side and examined the pouch with interest. "Do you suppose it's safe?" she asked. "I don't know," Elijah replied. "I'll ask Jeb to look at it before we use it. I'm more keen to treat Calvin's bite with this than I am to remove his leg entirely." Hazel nodded with wholehearted agreement, and Elijah pulled her into his arms for warmth while they waited for the next part of their journey. Chapter 15. While he did not wish to admit it, Elijah had felt concerns about trusting the lives of his family and the other travelers to the Shoshone guides as they maneuvered their way through the South Pass. He soon discovered he had allowed prejudices and ignorance to cloud his judgment, as the Indians were exceptionally helpful and possessed significant knowledge about the route. The weather was terrible, windy and blustering and debilitatingly cold, but the wagon train made it through the pass with little trouble, and Elijah was reasonable enough to credit the Shoshone with the success. Even the medicinal pouch the Indian had given him for Calvin's leg, which turned out to be a poultice, was a blessing. Within a day of application, the swelling had receded to half its bloated size, and the boy was full of energy. Elijah looked for that Indian the rest of the way along the pass to thank him in any way he could, but he never saw him again. Though they had managed to navigate the South Pass without incident, the toils of the long journey were finally beginning to lay their claim. Many times at night, in their wagon circle, the travelers mused amongst one another that nothing terribly tragic had occurred. In fact, Calvin's snake bite was perhaps the worst. As they entered Idaho and braved the frozen wild, however, nature stepped in and took offense to their luck. The first appearance of trouble arose with frostbite. Many of those who walked constantly took off their mittens and socks to find waxy, whitened fingertips and toes that had frozen hard to the touch. Ears as well suffered the same plight. No amount of bundling in warm clothes helped anymore, as the wind and snow were just too persistent, and more than one meeting was held about possibly setting up a temporary camp to remain until the thaw began. Most of the travelers, including Elijah, did not wish to stop for an unknown length of time, and so the train continued. Hypothermia struck next, and it was with this onset that the tales of lost pioneers came to fruition. A 2-year-old child was the first to fall prey to the frozen death, and in her wake came several more. Even Emmanuel Stedman, one of the 3 brothers journeying west together, who often helped Elijah and Jeb with more difficult tasks, would not awaken one morning. His siblings were forced to leave him a short ways off the trail and press onward, but Elijah did not forget him. Miraculously, none of the Crawford clan had thus far suffered the same fate. Calvin was the least capable of warming movement, and most likely to become frostbitten or worse. But Timothy insisted on sitting at his brother's side in the wagon bed and moving the little boy's limbs about to stimulate blood flow. It was not unusual for Elijah to glance over for reassurance that his children's lips were only mildly blue and see Timothy bending Calvin's legs back and forth rapidly or shaking his arms up and down in an almost comical fashion. Nellie, too, preferred to sit in the wagon instead of walk, but Hazel stood firm on the matter and insisted the small child stride along with the adults several times a day, if only to keep warm for a short time. Hazel had started to show signs of frostbite after tromping through snow in her toe-squeezing shoes for so long, but the moment she discovered the slight color change in her skin, she packed the shoes away and exchanged them for a pair of slightly oversized boots from Lillian and several layers of socks. Elijah had symptoms himself. His two smallest fingers on his left hand were white and numb on the tips, as they were the fingers he often slid into the oxen's harness to redirect them when they began to stray slightly. Overall, though, he considered his family one of the lucky ones. Then, however, they met the blizzard. What remained of the train had made it well into Idaho, an exciting notion for everyone, as the next state they would reach was Oregon. The couple, who had intended to go their separate way to California, had changed their mind given the state of the weather, and instead decided to follow along with the others to take up in Oregon until spring, when it was safe to travel again. But the numbers had dwindled eerily low nonetheless. Only 8 wagons creaked their way along the path now, and those that had been left behind either had been broken beyond repair, in which case the items within were spread amongst the others for safekeeping until arriving at the final destination, or had been abandoned when entire families had perished in the cold, in which case the surviving travelers took what they needed before moving on. When the first wave of the blizzard hit, it was as if Elijah had been plunged into isolation. The 7 other wagons were completely invisible to him, blanketed by the opaque diamond sheet of crystallized snow that plummeted down in painful shards. He could see only his own wagon, blurry and faded, but even that disappeared when the gales roared. "Hazel!" he shouted. His voice whipped back at him in echoes, as if the snow was actually a box he was trapped inside. "Hazel!" He heard a tinny cry, staccato with syllables but completely unintelligible. The blizzard had come on so unexpectedly and so rapidly that he had not thought to look where she was, but he assumed she was on the opposite side of the wagon and began to battle his way over there. He reached for the bed's wooden lip and held tightly, using it as leverage to push himself against the powerful winds. To his relief, he could hear the children well enough from this vantage point, though he was also unable to make out what they were saying, but the mere sounds of their voices were enough to reassure him they had not been blown clear off the wagon or struck dead by a heavy ice block thrown from the sky. "Hazel!" he bellowed again, now skimming the wagon's rear and curving onto the other side. "Elijah!" she called. Hearing his name in her tuneful tones sent a sigh of relief throughout his entire body, and he reached forward. His fingers closed around her arm. Pulling her back slightly toward him, he yelled, "We need to stop. We have to get into an alcove like the Shoshone showed us." "We can't," she cried. Even with snow piercing his eyes, he could see she was terrified. "What if we lose the train?" "It doesn't matter. We need to get out of the wind, or we'll all freeze to death where we stand." She nodded in agreement and jumped. Her foot swung over the side of the wagon as though she were mounting a running horse, and she rolled into the bed of the wagon with ease. Even in his panic and desperation to get his family out of the wicked elements, Elijah could not help but be impressed by his wife's skillful agility. He would have to ask her if she ever rode horses in her earlier years after the storm passed. Trudging his way up to the oxen, Elijah seized the harness and redirected the cattle to the right. From his observations before the blizzard arrived, the trail was too open to simply stop and set up camp right there. They needed to venture off to the side, where hills of various sizes could provide a measure of shelter. They happened across no other wagons as they veered, which Elijah found both surprising and worrisome. Perhaps the others had decided to continue on, or perhaps they had stopped already. Either way, his plan did not change, and he continued forth until a bank of snow rising at least 12 feet high emerged through the sleety canvas before him. Several hours later, Elijah was grateful he had decided to bring a number of farming supplies to Oregon rather than purchasing them there. With the help of a wide-mouthed shovel and Hazel, he was able to clear out a cavernous dent in the snowbank. It was far from a perfect hill house, but it protected them from the wind on 3 sides, and that was better than nothing. Ushering Timothy and Nellie into the makeshift cave, he lifted Calvin from the wagon. Hazel gathered as much as she could to lay beneath the boy on the snowy ground. "How are we to set a fire?" Hazel asked after they settled Calvin comfortably. "We will melt the walls and end up frozen bricks." "Come," Elijah told her. "I've an idea." The blizzard was still raging when night fell. Elijah had unhitched the oxen and dug them a cavern of their own for the evening, though he could only hope they remained inside and did not wander away. Fortunately, both Frank and Figgy seemed exhausted and rather groggy in the extreme conditions, so Elijah had hope he would find them there in the morning, alive and well after a sleep. Inside the family's snow cave, he had put his idea to use, and Hazel was tending to the children's warmth without a qualm. They had no flaming fire as every other night on their travels. Rather, Elijah had ignited a small fire just enough to create long-lasting embers. The embers did not heat the air, of course, but he had shown Hazel how to rest sacks of grain atop them until the sacks reached a temperature warm enough to heat the body without burning the material or the grain inside. It was working brilliantly thus far. The children were curled up together with cozy sacks placed around them, and their lips were already returning to a natural pink hue. "I don't know if we're going to make it." Hazel's voice was raspy and monotonous, and it alarmed Elijah to hear. She was ordinarily quite positive. He looked at her with his brows furrowed. "Why do you say that?" "We've lost so many already." When she turned her gaze to him, he could see tears sparkling in her eyes. "And this is the worst weather yet? How are we all to pull out of this?" Elijah hesitated. He did not want to make promises he could not keep, but he also did not want her to despair and give up. With a small sigh, he said, "We try. That's all we can do. The rest is in God's hands." "I need to confess something," Hazel wept suddenly. Her entire face was twisted with misery, and she trembled with despair. Elijah's heart sank a fraction, his stomach flipping. What could she possibly have to confess to him? They had spent practically every minute of every day for the last 5 months together, and he had observed nothing wayward. She took in a breath, a sharp and purposeful breath, then said, "When we were married, I didn't intend to stay married. I wanted to get to Oregon so Nellie and I could be with my sister, and I planned to have the marriage annulled once we arrived. It seemed ideal. You were only seeking a mother for your boys, and I needed a way to my family. There weren't emotions or affections to consider at that time, but now, her voice broke and 2 fat tears rolled down her cheeks. In a crackling voice, she finished, "I needed to tell you. Omission of the truth is near enough to a lie, and I don't want to lie to you." Elijah had gone numb as he listened, and he knew it was not the cold penetrating his bones. Had she admitted her plans months ago, he likely would have shrugged it off and resigned to finding a new replacement mother for his children once he settled in Oregon. To hear it with his heart full of her, however, was piercing, and he had to force his tongue to form the words he did not want to say. "Do you still intend to have the marriage annulled?" he asked dully. Hazel blinked, and more tears severed the smoothness of her skin with moist tracks. "I don't know if you could want me after this," she murmured. "I don't know if you'll have me." Elijah warmed again, but the warmth was intense, searing. It bloomed in his chest and spilled outward in every direction until he felt he could have leaped to his feet and undressed to his undergarments and still broken a sweat. He knew this feeling. He had experienced it once before. That pivotal moment when a man could subscribe to his ego and move on, or relinquish any semblance of control to the woman before him in hopes of adamant reciprocation. He chose the latter. "Hazel," he whispered. He reached for her chin and cupped it in his palm. Tilting her face up to his, he saw everything beautiful and terrible and extraordinary and mundane in her eyes, and he did not look away. Her tears moistened his hand as she continued to cry, but he cleared the droplets from her cheeks with his thumb, and delved so deeply into her gaze that his soul touched hers. "I love you." Her lips parted, and he heard a gasp slip through her teeth. "I want you now. I want you forever. Hazel, you have given me life when I thought mine was over. You have treated my boys as if they were your own. Even Timothy has taken to you, and I had my doubts he would. You are the epitome of goodness, the picture of beauty, and I am just a farm boy." He stroked her jawline, and she tilted her face into his touch. "I will not have you, because you are not one to be had. It is I who is to be had by you, and I humbly ask you to do so, or I am certain to perish with a broken heart, for I love you with my entire self." She was breathing slowly, deeply, and he could see her chest rising and falling with each breath. Sentiment washed across her face, and she sighed sweetly. "I love you too." Elijah swooped low and pressed his mouth to hers. His hand left her chin as he pressed his palms to her cheeks, tugging her against him until not a shadow of space lingered between them. Her body formed against his as though they were one, and her arms looped around his neck. He kissed her passionately, holding her to him, and then pulled back to look once more into her eyes. "We will make it, my love," he said firmly. "We will make it, because I refuse to allow our life together to end before it begins." Hazel's Hope. Epilogue. The sky was broad and endless in its turquoise fervor, punctuated only by a stray cloud of puffy cotton when the delicate breeze fancied a companion. Sunshine billowed down in soothing rays of gold to kiss the landscape below, which was bright with new greenness and inviting to the eye. Salt and soil hung thick in the air as a pungent perfume, but it was a pleasant aroma, promising a plentiful season's harvest. Though there was little around in the way of activity, the sounds of childish laughter rippled in every direction and caressed the ears of those who listened. Hazel was in paradise. They did make it after all. The blizzard roared and raged through the night, but she awoke the following morning to a calm scene, as white as swan's down, and all was right in the world. Elijah loved her, she loved him, the children were revived to good health, and the oxen were right where her husband had left them. Even they had enough sense not to brave the torrential snowstorm. It turned out they had not been abandoned by the wagon train, as the others had taken shelter in, much the same fashion as the Crawfords, and they rejoined as a group before continuing along to Oregon. Now she was here. She had reached her destination, but very differently than she had imagined. Rather than sharing a residence with her sister, she lived with Elijah in their very own home. It was a humble abode, just 2 rooms and hardly impressive, but it was cozy and comfortable, and theirs. Elijah had already begun farming on the plot he had purchased, and soon the space surrounding the small cabin would be rife with leafy seedlings. Never before had Hazel so eagerly looked forward to what life would bring next. Though she had not taken up house with her family, Hazel had made the trip to see them. Elijah accompanied her, of course, as did the children, and she was able to see what her sister had been doing since venturing west herself. After becoming acquainted with his in-laws, Elijah promised Hazel he would settle near enough to visit, and he indeed kept his word. She now saw her sibling more than she ever had since entering adulthood. Arms wrapped around her waist as she surveyed the skyline, simply drinking in the vision. She looked over her shoulder to see Elijah, and he planted an affectionate kiss on her cheek. "You looked so peaceful, I just had to come stir you up a bit," he teased, jostling her a little. Hazel giggled. Her laugh was joined by Nellie's as the little girl sprinted past in pursuit of a roguish butterfly. Hobbling closely behind her was Calvin, and he called out, Catch it, Nellie!" The boy had improved immensely. The Indian's poultice had brought his leg back to nearly normal proportion, and one of the first things they did upon reaching their final location was bring Calvin to a doctor. Luckily, the need for amputation had passed, and though the doctor advised Elijah and Hazel that it would likely take months for Calvin to regain full use of his legs after being off of them for so long, his outlook for an able little boy was bright. "My look!" Another youthful voice rang out, this one slightly more mature. Hazel turned and saw Timothy crouching beside a patch of sticky grass. He prodded a finger forward and withdrew it, revealing a fat green caterpillar. He straightened up and held it in the air with delight. "See it?" "I see it," Hazel laughed. Timothy had become her shadow. He was constantly asking her to assign him tasks and proudly awaited her praise when he completed them. His maturity had not waned, but he also no longer deprived himself of boyhood. Elijah had often asked Timothy to help him farm rather than allowing the boy to play during the first few weeks, and Hazel had stepped in. "Let him be, Elijah," she urged. "He's been too grown up for too long. He'll be a man soon enough." "Children need to learn responsibility," Elijah protested. "They cannot be made to play all day." Hazel had merely smiled and kissed him lightly. "He's learning responsibility, darling. He has chores, and he's always asking for more. I dare say he's more responsible than I was at his age." At this, Elijah had shot his arms out and yanked her down to his lap, and he tickled her neck with his scruff as he growled playfully. "I wonder if he's more responsible than you are now." So went their days, Elijah preparing his crops and Hazel tending house, while the children helped when they could and played when they were unable to help. It was a simple life in the untamed lands of the West, and Hazel was fit to burst with happiness. Elijah's mouth found her ear as she watched Timothy poking the caterpillar curiously. "I need to fetch a new rake from town," he told her. "Shall I bring you back some molasses for a cake?" "That would be lovely," she answered, turning in his grasp to face him. He bent and kissed her. "Is there anything else my lovely wife desires?" She beamed. A breath of wind caught her hair, which hung loosely over her shoulders, and swirled it around her cheeks. Elijah reached to brush the stray locks free and kissed the places they had been before looking at her expectantly, awaiting her answer. "No," she said honestly. "Everything is perfect,